Hey guys, tonight we are stepping back to a December you barely recognise. A freezing, war-torn, deeply uncertain Christmas in 1776 colonial America. Picture yourself waking not to twinkling lights and wrapped presents, but to the crack of ice forming on the water bucket beside your straw mattress. The fire died sometime around 3 in the morning, and now your breath hangs visible in the grey dawn light filtering through oiled paper windows. There is no central heating, no insulation worth mentioning, and no cheerful holiday playlist drifting from invisible speakers. There is only the cold, the distant rumble of a war that might reach your doorstep any day, and the vague awareness that today is sometime in early December, though you cannot be entirely certain because calendars are a luxury, and keeping track of dates feels almost laughably irrelevant when survival demands your full attention. You probably would not survive a week here if we are being honest. The food preservation alone would take you down, one bad batch of salted pork, one sip of contaminated cider, and your modern immune system would wave a white flag. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me where you are listening from and what time it is where you are. I always love seeing how this little community stretches across time zones and continents. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You swing your legs off the rope-strung bed frame, feet meeting a floor so cold it feels almost wet. The boards beneath you are hewn by hand, fitted imperfectly, and they creak with a sound that has become the background music of your existence. Through the gaps, you can feel drafts rising from the root cellar below, carrying with them the earthy scent of stored turnips and the faint mustiness of aging apples. This is December in the American colonies, and you are somewhere in the middle of it all, perhaps Pennsylvania, but perhaps New Jersey, perhaps one of the countless small settlements scattered across a landscape that Europeans have been reshaping for barely 150 years. The house around you is modest by any standard. One main room dominates the structure, serving simultaneously as kitchen, dining area, living space, and on the coldest nights, bedroom for the entire family. A loft above holds additional sleeping pallets for children or servants, accessible by a ladder so worn its rungs have developed smooth divots from generations of climbing hands. The walls are whitewashed plaster over the timber frame, and where the plaster has cracked or crumbled, you can see the wattle and daub beneath, a mixture of sticks, straw, and clay that provides surprisingly effective insulation when properly maintained. Yours has not been properly maintained in several years. The war has made everything difficult. You shuffle toward the hearth, where last night's embers still glow faintly beneath a blanket of grey ash. Reviving the fire is your first task, as it will be every morning for the rest of your life. There is no switching on a thermostat, no adjusting a dial. There is only the careful arrangement of kindling, the patient coaxing of flame, and the gradual addition of larger logs until the heat becomes sufficient to push back the December chill. This process takes time. Time you will learn to factor into every winter morning, time that shapes the rhythm of colonial existence in ways modern minds struggle to comprehend. The firewood itself represents hours of labour. Someone, perhaps you, perhaps a son or hired hand, spent autumn days felling trees, splitting logs, and stacking cordwood against the house's exterior wall. A typical colonial home burns between 15 and 40 cords of wood per winter, depending on size and climate. Each cord represents a stack 4 feet high, 4 feet wide, and 8 feet long. Historians still argue whether this constant demand for fuel contributed significantly to deforestation patterns in early America, or whether the cleared land primarily served agricultural expansion. What remains undisputed is that without adequate firewood, you simply do not survive December. As the flames begin to catch and dance, you become aware of sounds beyond your immediate space. A rooster crows somewhere nearby, your neighbour's, since yours was eaten 2 months ago when supplies ran low. The muffled thump of someone chopping wood carries through the morning air. A baby cries in one of the nearby houses, that thin, piercing wail that seems to carry impossibly far in cold air. These are the sounds of a community stirring to life, each household beginning its own daily battle against winter's slow siege. You should eat something, but the options are limited. Breakfast in colonial America is not the elaborate affair that later centuries will romanticize. For most families, the morning meal consists of whatever remains accessible and requires minimal preparation. Perhaps there is leftover cornmeal mush from last night, now congealed into a solid mass that can be sliced and fried in bacon grease. Perhaps there is bread, actual bread, if you're fortunate enough to have wheat flour, or more likely a dense, heavy loaf made from rye or corn. There might be some hard cheese, dried apple rings, or a handful of nuts. There is almost certainly beer or cider, since water remains profoundly untrustworthy, and everyone from children to grandparents drinks fermented beverages throughout the day. The beer is weak by modern standards, what brewers call small beer, containing just enough alcohol to kill waterborne pathogens without actually intoxicating the drinker. You gulp it down with your cold mush, not particularly enjoying either, but understanding that calories and hydration are non-negotiable requirements. Outside the pool, light is strengthening, revealing a landscape painted in shades of brown and grey. The trees stand bare, their branches etching dark lines against a pale sky that promises neither sun nor snow, just the relentless, damp cold that defines mid-Atlantic winters. You think perhaps about Christmas. The word surfaces in your mind like a half-forgotten dream, trailing associations that feel both familiar and strange. If you have come from certain parts of England, Christmas carries memories of feasting, of mumming and wassailing, of church services and community celebration. If your family fled religious persecution in earlier decades, Christmas might represent something far more complicated, a papist holiday, a remnant of the corrupt Church of Rome, a celebration your grandparents explicitly rejected when they boarded ships bound for the New World. The Puritans who founded New England did not simply ignore Christmas, they actively suppressed it, passing laws that fined anyone caught, observing the day with feasting or recreation. This is not the Christmas you know. There are no wreaths on doors, no evergreen garlands draped over mantles, no stockings hung with care. There is no Santa Claus. That figure will not emerge in recognisable form for another 50 years, and even then he will bear little resemblance to the red-suited character of modern imagination. There are no Christmas trees in most colonial homes, though you have heard rumours that German settlers in Pennsylvania maintain this peculiar tradition, bringing actual trees indoors and decorating them with candles and carved ornaments. The practice sounds frankly dangerous and more than a little bizarre. One stray spark and the whole house goes up. What there is, in December 1776, is war. The conflict that began more than a year ago with shots fired at Lexington and Concord has devolved into something that looks increasingly like defeat. The Continental Army, such as it is, has been driven from New York, chased across New Jersey, and now huddles on the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware River, waiting for something, victory, reinforcement, or perhaps simply the end. General Washington's force has dwindled from nearly 20,000 men to fewer than 6,000, and many of those remaining are sick, demoralised, and counting the days until their enlistments expire on January 1st. You've heard the news in fragments, carried by travellers and newspapers that arrive days or weeks after events occur. The British occupy New York City. Hessian soldiers, German mercenaries hired by King George, are stationed throughout New Jersey, including the town of Trenton, just across the river. Loyalist neighbours have been emboldened, while Patriot supporters grow quieter, less certain, more inclined to hedge their bets. The revolution, which seemed so promising in that heady summer of independence declarations, now totters on the edge of collapse, and yet life continues. The cow still needs milking. The fire still needs tending. The children still need feeding, teaching, disciplining, and protecting from a world that offers danger at every turn. Whatever Christmas means or does not mean, December 25th will arrive like any other winter day, demanding the same labour, the same endurance, the same stubborn insistence on survival that defines existence in this unforgiving time. You finish your meagre breakfast and begin to dress properly for the outdoors. There are chores to complete, neighbours to check on, and perhaps news to gather from whoever has travelled through recently. The day stretches ahead of you, cold and uncertain, filled with tasks that would exhaust a modern person by noon. But you have learned, through necessity, to pace yourself. Winter is a marathon, not a sprint. You will conserve energy where you can, work steadily through necessary tasks, and trust that spring will eventually return, as it always has. For now, though, you stand at the threshold of December 1706, about to step into a world where Christmas exists as barely a whisper, where war looms over every decision, and where survival itself constitutes a kind of daily victory. The fire crackles behind you. The cold waits beyond the door, and somewhere in the back of your mind you wonder what the next few weeks will bring, whether they will deliver disaster or deliverance, whether you will still be standing when the new year dawns. You push open the door and step outside, breath-forming clouds in the frigid air. The journey through colonial America's strangest Christmas has begun. The cold hits your face like a slap, sharp and immediate, as you step into the December morning. You pull your coat tighter, wool, hand-woven, patched in 3 places, and survey the world beyond your doorstep. The ground is hard but not frozen solid, that treacherous mid-December state where mud and ice compete for dominance, making every step a negotiation. Smoke rises from chimneys. Throughout the settlement, thin grey columns climbing toward a sky the colour of old pewter. The smell of wood smoke mingles with livestock odours, and the crisp, almost metallic scent of approaching winter. As you begin your morning tasks, your mind drifts to something your neighbour mentioned last week, a conversation about Christmas and whether anyone would mark it this year. He laughed when he said it, a bitter sound that carried no humour. "Christmas," he repeated, shaking his head. "My grandfather would have had me whipped for even speaking the word." This struck you as strange at first, but the more you have learned about colonial religious history, the more you understand. The shadow of Puritanism stretches long across these December days, even in 1776, even after more than a century of gradual softening. The Puritans who established Massachusetts Bay Colony in the 1620s and 1630s did not simply dislike Christmas, they considered it an abomination. To their minds, December 25th represented everything wrong with the corrupt Anglican Church they had fled, which itself had retained too many Catholic traditions for their comfort. The date had no biblical foundation. Nowhere in Scripture does anyone specify when Jesus was born. And early Christians celebrated the event at various times throughout the year before the Church eventually settled on the December the 25th, likely to compete with existing pagan winter festivals. The Puritans knew this, and they found the whole business offensive. In 1659, the Massachusetts General Court passed a law imposing a 5-shilling fine on anyone caught observing Christmas. The legislation specifically targeted anybody found observing by abstinence from labour, feasting or any other way, any such days as Christmas Day. 5 shillings represented roughly a week's wages for a common labourer. No small sum, and enough to make most colonists think twice about any Yuletide celebration. The law remained on the books until 1681, but its cultural impact persisted far longer. Multiple generations grew up understanding that Christmas was, at best, suspicious, and at worst, actively sinful. You feed the chickens, scattering dried corn across the frozen ground, and watching them scramble in their ridiculous jerky fashion. The birds provide a rare source of fresh protein in winter. Eggs, primarily, though egg production drops dramatically in the cold months. Come spring, you might have enough eggs to trade, but for now, you count yourself lucky when the hens produce more than 2 or 3 per day. One of the birds is looking thin, moving slowly. You make a mental note to watch her. Sick chickens spread disease quickly, and you cannot afford to lose what little livestock remains. The Puritan attitude toward Christmas was not merely religious conservatism. It contained a specific critique of how the holiday was traditionally celebrated in England. English Christmas, by the 17th century, had become a raucous affair, a 12-day festival of feasting, drinking, mumming, and misrule. Servants became masters for a day, where sailors went door to door demanding food and drink. Plays were performed, games were played, and general disorder prevailed. To the Puritans, this looked less like religious observance than barely controlled chaos, a remnant of pagan festivals dressed in thin Christian clothing. When they established their godly commonwealth in New England, they intended to strip away all such corruptions. Worship would be simple, direct, focused on scripture and sermon. Holy days would be observed only when specifically commanded by God, the Sabbath certainly, and days of thanksgiving or fasting as circumstances warranted, but never arbitrary celebrations attached to dates with no biblical authority. Christmas fell firmly into this forbidden category, along with Easter, Saints' Days, and any other occasion that smacked of Catholic or Anglican tradition. You move on to the woodpile, selecting logs for the afternoon fire. The wood has been seasoning since spring, stacked with careful gaps to allow air circulation, and most of it is dry enough to burn cleanly. Greenwood hisses and smokes, produces less heat, and deposits creosote in the chimney, a substance that can ignite and burn your house down if allowed to accumulate. You have seen chimney fires, watched helplessly as neighbours lost everything to flames that started as nothing more than a spark meeting a creosote deposit. Such fires often occur in the coldest weather, when families burn wood continuously and neglect to clean their flues. Historians still argue whether the Puritan suppression of Christmas constituted genuine religious principle, or served additional social purposes. Some scholars suggest that the elite colonists feared the traditional Christmas celebrations because of their subversive elements, the inversion of social hierarchy, the temporary empowerment of lower classes, the general suspension of normal rules. By banning Christmas, these historians argue, Puritan leaders maintained control over a population that might otherwise have used the holiday as an excuse for protest or rebellion. Others counter that the Puritans genuinely believed what they professed, that their objection to Christmas was theological rather than political, and that attributing cynical motives to their ban oversimplifies a complex religious position. What remains clear is that by 1776, more than a century after the ban was lifted, Christmas still carried a whiff of impropriety throughout much of New England. You've heard of churches that deliberately hold regular services on December the 25th, not special Christmas services, but ordinary worship as if to emphasize that the day possesses no particular significance. Ministers preach against the sin of Christmas celebration, warning their congregations about the dangers of backsliding into popish practice. Even families, inclined to mark the occasion, do so quietly, almost furtively, lest they attract disapproval from neighbours or church elders. The situation varies considerably, of course. Not everyone in the colonies traces their ancestry to Puritan stock. Dutch settlers in New York maintained their own traditions, including a December gift-giver named Sinterklaas, who would eventually evolve into something more familiar. The scattered Catholic communities, though tiny and often persecuted, observed Christmas with whatever devotion their circumstances allowed. Anglican parishes in the middle and southern colonies held services and encouraged moderate celebration, though even they tended to avoid the excesses that characterised English Christmas. You carry an arm-load of wood back towards the house, pausing to catch your breath. The air burns cold in your lungs, and you can feel the strain in muscles that never fully rest during winter. A neighbour passes on the road, if you can call it a road, more of a rutted path between properties, and raises a hand in greeting. You nod back, but do not stop to talk. Conversation requires standing still, and standing still means getting colder. Inside, you stack the wood near the hearth and check the fire. It has settled into a steady burn, casting orange light across the room and radiating enough heat to make the area within 3 feet of the fireplace almost comfortable. Beyond that radius, the cold persists, and you can see your breath if you stand too close to the exterior walls. This is simply how winter works in colonial America. You dress warmly, you stay near the fire, you accept that cold is a constant companion until spring returns. The religious divide over Christmas reflects deeper fractures in colonial society, fractures that the current war has widened into chasms. The New England colonies, dominated by Puritan descendants, threw themselves into the revolutionary cause with particular fervour. The southern colonies, with their Anglican traditions and plantation economies, have proven more divided. The middle colonies, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, contain such a mix of religious and ethnic groups that any generalization becomes hazardous. German Lutherans and Reformed congregations, English Quakers, Scottish Presbyterians, Dutch, Reformed communities and scattered Catholics all live in proximity, each carrying their own attitudes toward Christmas and everything else. You think about your own family's traditions, or lack thereof. Your parents rarely spoke of Christmas, except occasionally to reminisce about celebrations remembered from English childhoods, traditions that had no place in the New World. Your mother once mentioned something about Christmas pudding, the way her own mother made it, but the memory seemed to pain her, and she did not bring it up again. Your father attended church services on December the 25th when they were offered, but he treated the day as any other, working until dark and eating whatever meal was available. If Christmas meant something special to him, he never said so, and you learn not to ask. The war has complicated everything. You have heard that British officers in occupied New York plan elaborate Christmas celebrations, balls, feasts, theatrical performances, making merry while the rebellion collapses around them. Such reports inspire contradictory emotions, resentment at the occupier's presumption, nostalgia for festivities you have never actually experienced, and a gnawing worry that perhaps the British way of life, Christmas celebrations included, might ultimately prevail. If the Continental Army fails, if the revolution ends in defeat, what then? Would Christmas become something imposed by victors, another reminder of colonial submission? These thoughts swirl as you prepare for the day's main labour. Whatever Christmas means or does not mean, the work continues. Animals need tending, fences need mending, food needs preserving. December offers no respite, no vacation, no holiday in the modern sense. The Puritans may have banned Christmas celebrations, but they could not ban winter itself, and winter demands tribute in the form of endless grinding work. You step outside again, heading toward the barn. The sun has risen higher, though it provides little warmth, hanging in the sky like a pale counterfeit of its summer self. Somewhere in Boston, in Philadelphia, in small towns throughout the colonies, people are waking to this same week light, facing this same December cold, carrying the same tangled feelings about a holiday that refuses to settle into clear meaning. Christmas in 1776 exists in a state of suspension, caught between English tradition and American rejection, between religious observance and deliberate neglect, between the past that shaped these colonies and the uncertain future that awaits. The Puritan shadow still falls across these December days, long and cold and unmistakable, but other. Traditions persist in the margins, kept alive by communities that never accepted the ban or never knew it applied. As you cross the hard ground toward your morning chores, you wonder what those other colonists are doing, how they are marking these weeks before December 25th, whether their December looks anything like yours. The answer, you will discover, depends entirely on where you happen to stand. You finish the morning's barn work with hands so cold you can barely flex your fingers, and you stand for a moment in the relative shelter of the structure, listening to the animals shift and breathe around you. The cow has been milked, a modest yield as winter milk always runs thin, and the horses have been fed and watered. Now you have a decision to make. Your cousin has invited you to visit, sent word last week through a travelling peddler who carried messages along with his wares. The cousin lives 2 days' journey south in a settlement closer to the Virginia border, and he mentioned something about Christmas dinner. The invitation struck you as almost exotic, like receiving word of a party on the moon. The difference between your December and your cousin's comes down to something as simple and profound as geography. You exist in what might loosely be called the Middle Colonies, that patchwork region stretching from New York through Pennsylvania and into the upper reaches of the Chesapeake. Your family's religious background is mixed, some Presbyterian, some Anglican, a great-grandmother who may or may not have been Quaker depending on which relative tells the story. But your cousin married into a Virginia family, old tobacco money, people who trace their American roots back to Jamestown and who never, not for one generation, stopped celebrating Christmas. Virginia's relationship with Christmas stands in almost perfect opposition to New England's. The colony was founded not by religious refugees seeking to build a godly commonwealth, but by commercial adventurers seeking profit. The Virginia Company sent settlers to extract wealth from the New World, and those settlers brought with them the Church of England and all its traditions, Christmas very much included. When the Puritans in Massachusetts were fining their neighbours for feasting on December the 25th, Virginians were hosting elaborate parties that would have seemed perfectly normal in any English country house. You consider your cousin's invitation as you walk back toward the house. 2 days' travel in December is no small undertaking. The roads, such as they are, will be rutted with frozen mud or slick with ice. River crossings become treacherous as ferry operators make judgment calls about whether the ice is thick enough to walk across or thin enough to navigate by boat. Accommodations along the way range from acceptable taverns to barns where you might share space with livestock and questionable fellow travellers. And the war adds its own dangers. Patrol routes, suspicious soldiers, the possibility of being caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the pull of that Christmas dinner tugs at something in you. Your cousin's letters describe festivities that sound almost fantastical. Decorated homes, special foods, gatherings of neighbours and family, music and dancing that continue for days. He writes of the Yule log tradition, a massive piece of wood that burns throughout the 12 days of Christmas, chosen months in advance and hauled into the house with ceremony. He mentions wassail bowls and mince pies and roasted geese, and you find yourself salivating despite knowing that the reality probably falls short of the description. The regional divide in colonial Christmas observance reflects deeper differences in how various parts of America were settled and why. New England attracted religious dissenters seeking freedom to practice their austere faith without interference. The Chesapeake colonies, Virginia and Maryland, drew settlers, motivated primarily by economic opportunity, people who intended to recreate English life rather than reform it. The middle colonies, established later and with more diverse populations, developed their own complicated character, neither as religiously strict as New England, nor as traditionally English as the South. You step inside and begin preparing a midday meal, more of the same monotonous fare: bread, cheese, the last of yesterday's stew reheated over the fire. As you eat, you think about what you know of Southern Christmas traditions, pieced together from letters, conversations, and the occasional newspaper account. The celebrations centre on hospitality, on opening your home to guests who might travel considerable distances to attend. Plantation houses host parties that last for days, with visitors sleeping wherever space can be found and servants working around the clock to keep food and drink flowing. These celebrations carry their own complications, of course. The labour that makes such hospitality possible comes largely from enslaved people, whose own December experience looks nothing like the feasting and merriment of the Great House. Historians still argue whether enslaved people in the colonial South experienced Christmas as a welcome respite, a brief pause in the relentless work schedule, or as a cruel reminder of their bondage, forced to watch others celebrate while their own humanity went unacknowledged. Some evidence suggests that enslavers granted extra rations and time off during the Christmas period, perhaps recognising that even the most brutal system requires occasional release. Other evidence points to Christmas as a time of heightened surveillance and control, when enslavers worried that gatherings of enslaved people might lead to organising or revolt. You push these troubling thoughts aside, not because they are unimportant, but because there is nothing you can do about them this afternoon, and the work waiting for you will not complete itself. The afternoon stretches ahead, filled with tasks that must be done regardless of the date on the calendar. You will mend a section of fence that has been leaning dangerously. You will check the root cellar for signs of rot. You will perhaps visit the village, if you can call it that, to see whether any news has arrived from the eastern seaboard. As you work on the fence, wrestling wooden rails into place with numb fingers, you find yourself mapping the colonies in your mind, considering what Christmas looks like in each region. New England, quiet, deliberately ordinary, churches that refuse to mark the day with anything special, families that eat their regular meals and go about their regular business. The middle colonies, mixed, complicated, some households celebrating and others not. German settlers maintaining traditions that seem outlandish to their English neighbours. Quakers ignoring the day entirely on principle. The South, festivity that approaches English standards, great houses blazing with candles, parties and balls and gifts exchanged among the wealthy, a stark contrast to the austerity that prevails elsewhere. The quirky detail that sticks with you comes from a story your cousin included in his last letter. Apparently some Virginia families observe a tradition called Christmas guns, firing weapons into the air at dawn on December the 25th to announce the holiday's arrival. The practice sounds both celebratory and vaguely terrifying. The thought of your neighbours discharging firearms at first light would normally send you diving for cover. But in Virginia, apparently, this constitutes proper Christmas spirit. Historians have traced the custom to English and German antecedents, though the exact origins remain disputed. You finish with the fence as the afternoon light begins to fade, that early winter darkness that descends like a curtain around 4 or 5 o'clock. The temperature, never warm to begin with, drops noticeably as the sun sinks lower. You hurry back toward the house, already anticipating the fire's warmth, the brief comfort of sitting still before evening chores demand your attention. Inside, you add logs to the fire and light a single candle. Candles are expensive and you use them sparingly, positioning it near the window where its glow might be visible to anyone passing. This is not decoration, it is communication, a signal that the household is awake and active, that visitors would be welcome if they have news to share. In these dark December evenings, the sight of light in a neighbour's window provides its own small comfort, evidence that you are not alone in weathering the winter. Your thoughts return to the question of regional identity, how geography has shaped not just Christmas customs, but the entire character of different colonial societies. The New Englander who scorns December festivities and the Virginian who throws lavish Christmas balls, might technically share citizenship in a nascent nation, but their daily lives, their assumptions, their very definition of what constitutes proper behaviour diverge dramatically. The revolution has forced these disparate communities into alliance, binding them together against a common enemy, but the underlying differences persist. You wonder sometimes whether the alliance will hold. If the war ends, whenever it ends, however it ends, will the colonies remain united? The New England merchant and the Virginia planter, the Pennsylvania German and the New York Dutch, the frontier settler and the coastal city dweller, they have agreed, for the moment, that British rule must end. But what comes after? What will hold together a nation of such varied peoples, varied traditions, varied ideas about something as fundamental as whether December 25th deserves recognition? These questions feel too large for the small space of your home, too weighty for an evening when your primary concerns involve staying warm and fed. You set them aside as you set aside so many things in these difficult times and focus on the immediate present. There is stew to reheat. There is bread to slice. There is an evening to survive before you can burrow beneath your blankets and wait for sleep. But as you eat your simple meal, staring into the fire's shifting flames, the regional differences remain present in your mind. Somewhere in Massachusetts, a minister is preparing remarks for next Sunday's service, perhaps planning to remind his congregation that Christmas represents papist superstition. Somewhere in Virginia, a household is beginning preparations for a celebration that will last nearly 2 weeks. Somewhere in Pennsylvania, a German family is gathering around a candlelit tree, singing carols in their native tongue, and here you sit in the middle of it all, belonging fully to none of these traditions, inheriting fragments of each. This is America in 1776. Not one country but many, not one Christmas but dozens of different ones. December's unfolding simultaneously across a landscape that stretches farther than any single person can comprehend. The fire crackles, the darkness presses against the windows, and you settle in for another long winter night, wondering what tomorrow will bring. Morning arrives with a thin crust of frost on everything. The ground, the windows, the water bucket that sits just inside the door. You break the ice layer with your knuckles and splash your face with water so cold it makes your teeth ache. A daily ritual that serves as colonial America's version of a wake-up call. No gentle alarm clocks here, no gradual rising to consciousness. The cold announces day's arrival with brutal efficiency. You have been thinking about your neighbours to the west, the German families who settled throughout Pennsylvania and parts of New Jersey in the decades before the war. They keep to themselves, mostly, maintaining their language and customs in tight-knit communities that English colonists view with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. But this time of year, word filters out about their peculiar Christmas practices that seem both strange and strangely appealing, traditions that the English colonies have largely abandoned or never adopted. The Pennsylvania Dutch, as they have come to be called, a corruption of Deutsch, meaning German, brought with them Christmas customs that would eventually reshape the American holiday. They decorate trees, not just any trees, but evergreens brought inside the home, set up in the corner, adorned with candles, cookies, and handmade ornaments. The practice strikes most English colonists bizarre at best and dangerous at worst. An open flame on a dead tree inside a wooden house? The recipe for catastrophe seems obvious, yet the tradition persists. You have heard accounts from people who have visited German settlements during December, descriptions that paint vivid pictures of these tree-scented celebrations. The trees are usually small, set on tables rather than standing on the floor, though some families have begun using larger specimens. The candles are attached to branches with wire or melted wax, their flames casting shifting shadows across rooms that smell of pine and baking. The ornaments include carved wooden figures, blown glass balls imported from the old country, paper decorations cut into intricate patterns, and strings of dried fruit that double as treats for children. You dress warmly and step outside, your breath forming clouds that drift and dissipate in the still air. The German settlers interest you partly because they represent a kind of alternative history, a path colonial Christmas might have taken if different groups had dominated the early settlements. They prove that Christmas celebration and religious devotion are not mutually exclusive, that one can honour the holiday without descending into the dissolution the Puritans feared. The German Protestant denominations, Lutheran, Reformed, Moravian, maintained Christmas as a significant religious observance. though they stripped away what they considered Catholic excesses. They focused on the Nativity, on the Christ child as the central figure of the celebration, a figure who would eventually morph into something called the Christ kind, and later, through various evolutions, contribute to American Santa Claus mythology. The Christ kind was not a gift giver in the modern sense, but rather a symbol of the season's meaning, a reminder that December 25th commemorated something worth commemorating. You cross the yard toward the chicken coop, scattering feed and collecting the few eggs the hens have managed to produce. As you work, you think about what you have learned of German Christmas cookies, the elaborate baked goods that apparently constitute a major part of the celebration. The names roll through your mind, half remembered from conversations: Lebkuchen, a spiced honey cake that dates back centuries; Springel, anise, flavoured cookies pressed into decorative moulds; Pfeffernüsse, little peppery nut balls coated in powdered sugar. These cookies require ingredients that most colonial families cannot easily obtain: fine white flour, sugar, exotic spices imported at considerable expense. The German communities have maintained trade connections that supply such luxuries, and they have passed down the recipes through generations, each household guarding its particular formulas as family treasures. Historians still argue whether these baking traditions remained essentially unchanged from their European origins or evolved significantly in the New World, adapting to available ingredients and local conditions. What seems clear is that German Christmas in colonial America retained a warmth and deliberate festivity that English colonial Christmas largely lacked. This was not the raucous carnivalesque celebration of Old English tradition, the thing the Puritans had most feared. It was something gentler, more centred on family and faith, more compatible with the Protestant work ethic that dominated colonial life. Perhaps if the Puritans had encountered this version of Christmas rather than the wild English variety, they would not have banned the holiday so thoroughly. You finish with the chickens and move on to the larger livestock, your mind still occupied with thoughts of the German settlements. One quirky detail particularly fascinates you: the bell-snickling tradition. In the weeks before Christmas, costumed figures called bellsnickel go door to door, often dressed in furs or rags, their faces obscured by masks or soot. They carry switches and treats in equal measure, threatening to punish naughty children while rewarding good ones. The practice sounds terrifying. Imagine a masked stranger appearing at your door on a dark December evening, but apparently the children enjoy it, viewing the visits as exciting rather than frightening. The bellsnickel tradition represents a remnant of much older customs, European folk practices that mix pagan elements with Christian overlay in ways that scholars have spent careers attempting to untangle. Some see connections to Germanic wild man mythology, to fertility spirits associated with the winter solstice, to figures that Christianity absorbed and partially transformed without entirely erasing their original character. Others argue that such connections are overdrawn, that the bellsnickel is simply a folk custom and without deep mythological roots, a bit of seasonal fun that communities maintained because children enjoyed it. Whatever its origins, bellsnickling adds a theatrical element to German colonial Christmas that English celebrations largely lack. The English tradition included mumming, costumed performances and house-to-house visits, but the Puritan influence suppressed such practices in most American colonies. The Germans maintained them, keeping alive customs that would eventually blend with other influences to create the distinctly American Christmas of later centuries. You pause in your work to rest against a fence post, watching your breath rise and drift. The German communities fascinate you partly because they seem to have preserved something that English colonists lost or deliberately discarded. They remember how to celebrate. They have recipes passed down through generations, songs sung in a language their grandparents brought from across the ocean, decorations crafted by hand each year in patterns that have not changed for centuries. Your own household has no such traditions. Your family's memories stretch back only a few generations on American soil, and whatever customs your English ancestors maintained were abandoned somewhere along the way. You do not know your great-grandmother's Christmas pudding recipe. You do not know what songs your grandfather might have sung as a boy in whatever English village he left behind. The knowledge is simply gone, lost in the great, forgetting that accompanies migration and assimilation. The morning wears on, and you complete your chores with the methodical efficiency that survival demands. Your thoughts continue to circle around the German settlers and their carefully preserved traditions. Perhaps someday you think you will visit one of their communities during December, see for yourself what their Christmas looks like. The war makes such travel complicated, of course, but the war will not last forever. Someday things will be different. You remember a story someone told you about the Moravians, a German-speaking Protestant sect that established communities in Pennsylvania and North Carolina. They apparently celebrate Christmas with elaborate musical performances, candle-lit services that last for hours, the singing of hymns composed specifically for the season. The Moravians have a particular devotion to what they call the puts, elaborate nativity scenes that can fill entire rooms, depicting not just the manger but all of Bethlehem and the surrounding countryside, complete with miniature buildings, tiny figures, and ingenious mechanical devices that make the scenes move. The artistry involved staggers your imagination. You have seen nativity scenes, of course, small, simple arrangements that some families set out in December, but nothing approaching the scale and complexity the Moravians apparently achieve. Their putzes take weeks to construct, requiring materials gathered throughout the year, skills passed from parents to children, and a communal effort that brings entire communities together. The practice serves multiple purposes: religious instruction, artistic expression, community building, and sheer celebration of the season. As you head back toward the house, you find yourself wishing that your own community maintained such traditions. The German settlers' Christmas seems so much richer than the grim December you know, so much more alive with meaning and beauty. But wishing changes nothing. You are who you are, descended from the people who descended from you, inheriting whatever fragments of tradition survived the journey across the ocean and the generations since. Still, the German example suggests something important: that Christmas can be celebrated without abandoning religious principles or descending into chaos. The Puritans created a false choice, presenting the options as either total suppression or total dissolution. The Germans found a middle path, a way to mark the season with joy while maintaining order and devotion. Perhaps someday, American Christmas will find a similar balance, drawing from various traditions to create something new. The fire inside needs tending. The afternoon stretches ahead with its endless demands. But somewhere in the back of your mind you carry the image of a candlelit tree in a Pennsylvania farmhouse, of cookies shaped like stars and angels, of families singing in German, as snow falls softly outside. You push open the door and step back into the smoky dimness of your home, and for a moment you try to see the space through fresh eyes, through the eyes of someone from another time who might wonder how anyone could live this way. The answer, of course, is that you have no choice. This is home, this cramped and drafty structure, and it is probably better than what many of your neighbours possess. The room measures perhaps 16 feet by 20, not much larger than a modern parking space, yet it serves as the entire living quarters for your household. The dominant feature is the fireplace, an enormous structure built of fieldstone and clay mortar that occupies nearly one entire wall. The firebox opening is wide enough for a grown man to stand inside when no fire burns, and the hearth extends several feet into the room, a platform of flat stones where much of the cooking occurs. Above the fire, iron hooks and brackets allow for the hanging of pots and kettles at various heights, providing the only temperature control available. Closer to the flames for rapid boiling, higher up for gentle simmering. The smoke that makes your eyes water is an unavoidable consequence of this heating arrangement. Chimneys help, certainly. The technology has improved considerably over the past century, but even the best colonial chimney cannot capture all the combustion byproducts from an open hearth. The smoke rises, mostly, finding its way toward the flue, but plenty of it drifts sideways first, filling the upper reaches of the room with a perpetual grey haze. Everything you own smells faintly of wood smoke. Your clothes, your hair, your bedding, even your food carries the scent. Visitors from outside sometimes comment on it, though they themselves smell just as smoky. Nose blindness prevents anyone from recognizing their own contribution to the general aroma. You settle into a chair near the fire, one of only 2 chairs the household possesses, the other reserved for your spouse or most honoured guests. Everyone else sits on benches, stools, or simply on the floor near the hearth. The chair is not comfortable by modern standards, its seat woven from rope that has developed a permanent sag, its back perpendicular to the seat in a way that provides no lumbar support whatsoever. But it is a chair, a mark of status in a world where furniture represents significant investment. Looking around the room, you take inventory of your possessions. The bed stands in one corner, its frame constructed from rough timber, its mattress a cloth sack stuffed with straw that needs replacing every few months as the contents compact and decay. Ropes strung across the frame provide support, though the ropes stretch over time, requiring periodic tightening with a special tool, hence the expression sleep tight. Blankets piled on top are wool, homespun and home-woven, scratchy against the skin but effective at trapping body heat. A table occupies the room's centre, its surface scarred from years of food preparation and general use. The table is where you eat, where you work, where you do anything requiring a flat surface. Meals are served directly onto its wooden top or onto the trenchers, shallow wooden plates that also function as cutting boards. You own no china, no fine porcelain, nothing that could be considered decorative. Everything is functional, everything serves a purpose. The walls hold few ornaments. A looking glass hangs near the window, small and wavery, providing a distorted reflection that you use primarily to check that your face is clean. Several iron tools lean against the stone hearth. Fire pokes, tongs, a small shovel for managing ashes. A single shelf holds the household's few books, a Bible, an almanac, perhaps a volume of sermons or practical instruction. Reading is not a common pastime. The labour required to survive leaves little energy for leisure, and the dim light inside makes reading difficult in any case. The smell inside the house is layered and complex, something visitors from the modern world would find overwhelming. The predominant note is wood smoke, as mentioned, but beneath that lies a substrate of cooking odours that never quite dissipate. Yesterday's stew, last week's bacon grease, the perpetual presence of onions and root vegetables stored in the corner. Add to this the faint mustiness of clothing that cannot be properly laundered in winter, the animal smell that clings to anyone who works with livestock, and the general organic funk of human habitation without modern sanitation. You do not notice most of it anymore. Your nose adjusted long ago. Historians still argue whether colonial Americans experienced their living conditions as hardship or simply as normalcy. You cannot miss what you have never known, the argument goes, and the cramped, smoky, dimly lit spaces of colonial homes were simply how people lived. The concept of comfort as modern people understand it, temperature-controlled environments, abundant, light, private spaces for each family member, did not exist as an expectation. People expected to be cold in winter and hot in summer, expected to share sleeping spaces with siblings and sometimes strangers, expected their homes to smell of smoke and livestock and human existence. Yet there are hints that colonists did aspire to better conditions, did dream of more spacious homes with more adequate heating, did recognise that their circumstances involved genuine discomfort. Letters and diaries sometimes mention the cold with bitter complaint, the smoke with weary resignation, the cramped quarters with expressions of frustration. These were not people who simply accepted their lot without awareness of alternatives. They knew that wealthier colonists lived in larger houses with better heating. They knew that European nobility enjoyed palatial accommodation unimaginable to ordinary folk. They knew, in other words, that their circumstances were not inevitable, merely unavoidable given their resources. You rise from your chair to add another log to the fire, watching the sparks fly up the chimney. The flame catches the new wood, and for a moment, the room brightens, shadows retreating toward the corners. This is the best your home will look all day. Mid-afternoon, fire blazing, the weak winter sun providing what illumination it can through the oiled paper windows. Come evening, the space will darken into something that feels almost cave-like, lit only by fire and whatever candles you choose to burn. The windows themselves deserve mention. Glass windows exist in 1776, have existed for centuries in fact, but they remain expensive, especially in large sheets suitable for window panes. Your windows are covered with oiled paper, an alternative that provides some light transmission at a fraction of the cost. The paper is translucent rather than transparent. You can see shapes and shadows through it, can tell whether it is daylight or dark outside, but you cannot see details. Privacy is not an issue since no one can see in any more than you can see out, but the inability to gaze outside on a winter day contributes to the claustrophobic feeling that sometimes overtakes you. One quirky aspect of colonial home construction that visitors often notice: the lack of closets. Modern homes devote considerable space to storage, with closets in bedrooms, hallways, even bathrooms. Colonial homes have virtually none. Clothing hangs on pegs driven into walls, supplies sit on shelves or in chests. The concept of a dedicated storage room hidden away behind a door has simply not developed as part of architectural practice. Space is too precious, construction too expensive to waste on areas whose sole purpose is hiding things from view. You think about the holiday season approaching, about what it would mean to decorate this space for Christmas. There is nothing to decorate with, of course. No strings of lights, no garlands of tinsel, no carefully wrapped presents to arrange beneath a non-existent tree. But even if such things existed, where would you put them? Every surface already serves a function. Every corner already holds something necessary. The room contains precisely what it needs to contain, and not one item more. This is the reality of colonial living that romantic depictions often obscure, the relentless functionality, the absence of anything purely decorative, the way survival crowded out beauty as a daily priority. People did create beautiful things, quilts, furniture, metalwork, but even these beautiful things usually served practical purposes as well. The quilt kept you warm, the furniture held your belongings, the metalwork hung pots over fires. Pure decoration, beauty for its own sake, remained a luxury few could afford in either money or space. The fire crackles and pops, sending up another shower of sparks. You settle back into your chair, feeling the warmth against your face, the cold against your back where the chair provides insufficient insulation. This is home. This smoky, cramped, dimly lit space is where you will spend the coming Christmas, whatever that Christmas turns out to mean. The thought is neither cheering nor depressing, it simply is another fact of existence in December 1776. Outside, the light is already beginning to fade, the short winter day drawing toward its early close. You have a few hours before you must venture out again for evening chores. For now, you rest by the fire, gathering strength for whatever comes next. The evening chores are done, and you stand in the doorway of your home, watching the last light drain from the western sky. Tomorrow, you have decided, you will attempt a journey, not to your cousin's far-off Virginia plantation, that remains too ambitious for the current circumstances, but to the neighbouring settlement, a cluster of homes and businesses about 7 miles distant. News travels through there, and you have not had fresh news in nearly a week. In December 1776, with war swirling around you, a week without news feels like a lifetime. Travelling colonial America is never simple, but winter travel elevates difficulty to something approaching genuine danger. You will leave at first light, hoping to complete the journey before dark. 7 miles might sound trivial to a modern person accustomed to automobiles and highways, but you will be walking, or if fortunate, riding a horse through terrain that barely deserves the name road. The pace will be slow, the footing treacherous, the cold relentless. You close the door against the night and begin preparing for tomorrow's journey. This means checking your coat for holes that need patching, examining your boots for wear that might cause blisters or allow moisture to worry, assembling provisions to sustain you through a long day of physical exertion. The preparations feel both routine and momentous. Routine because travel is a necessary part of colonial life. Momentous because every journey carries risks that modern people can scarcely imagine. The roads of colonial America are not roads in any meaningful modern sense. They are paths beaten into existence by generations of feet and hooves, improved occasionally by local communities who dump gravel into the worst muddy patches or fell trees across boggy sections to create crude corduroy surfaces. In summer, these roads are dusty and rutted. In winter, they transform into something far worse, alternating stretches of frozen mud, slick ice, and boot-sucking mire where groundwater refuses to freeze. You will navigate these conditions without any of the equipment modern travellers take for granted. There are no waterproof boots, no insulated jackets, no GPS to guide you if you lose your way. You have wool, leather, and your own knowledge of the local terrain. These will have to suffice. They have sufficed for everyone who has made this journey before you, and they will suffice again, or they will not, and you will become one of the unfortunate souls whose frozen body is found beside a road come spring. That is not melodrama. People die of exposure in colonial America regularly, particularly in winter. The combination of inadequate clothing, unpredictable weather, and the absence of any emergency services means that a journey gone wrong can prove fatal. A twisted ankle that leaves you immobile, a sudden snowstorm that obliterates landmarks, a horse that bolts or dies, leaving you stranded miles from shelter. These are real possibilities that every traveller must weigh. The horse question is one you have been debating. Your household possesses a single horse, an aging mare named Patience who has earned her name through years of steady, unspectacular service. Taking Patience would speed the journey considerably, perhaps cutting the time in half, but it would also expose her to the same risks you face, and losing her would be a devastating blow to the household. Horses in 1776 represent enormous investments, not just in purchase price but in ongoing care, feed, shelter, veterinary attention when available. Replacing Patience would consume months of earnings, if it were possible at all. You decide to walk. The journey will take most of the day, but your own legs are more expendable than the horses. This is the cold calculus of colonial existence, weighing risks and resources, making decisions that might kill you because the alternatives are worse. Morning arrives cold and clear, a blessing, since rain or snow would make the journey far more difficult. You dress in layers, linen undergarments, wool shirt, wool waistcoat, heavy wool coat, all topped with a cloak that can be wrapped around you for additional warmth or spread over the ground for rest stops. Your hat is felt, wide-brimmed, practical. Your gloves are leather, lined with the wool already showing wear at the fingertips. Your boots are leather as well, stuffed with dry grass for insulation, a trick. You learned from a neighbour who claimed it was an old German practice. The first miles pass without incident. The road, such as it is, follows a creek valley, winding between hills that are covered with leafless trees. The landscape has a stark beauty in winter, the black branches against the grey sky creating patterns that artists might find compelling. You are not an artist, however, and the beauty registers only dimly against your primary concerns, watching the ground for hazards, maintaining a pace that generates warmth without exhausting you, staying alert for any sign of other travellers or potential threats. The war has made the roads more dangerous than usual, not just from soldiers, though soldiers are certainly a concern, but from the general breakdown of order that accompanies conflict. Thieves and deserters lurk in the woods, preying on travellers who venture out alone. Loyalist and patriot neighbours who once coexisted peacefully now eye each other with suspicion. And lone traveller might find himself questioned by either side, accused of carrying information to the enemy. The smart move is to appear as unremarkable as possible, to carry nothing of value, to have a simple, believable explanation for your journey ready at all times. Around mid-morning you reach the first major obstacle, a creek crossing. In warmer months, this creek can be forded easily, the water rarely rising above knee-height. In December, the situation becomes complicated. Ice covers portions of the creek, but not uniformly. Some sections have frozen solid, others retain open water, and the boundaries between the two are not always visible. Crossing requires careful judgment, testing the ice before committing your weight, being prepared to jump back if the surface begins to crack. Historians still argue whether colonial Americans developed specialized techniques for winter travel, or simply muddled through as best they could. Evidence exists for both positions. Some communities clearly maintain traditions of ice safety, knowledge passed down through generations about how to test ice thickness, how to distribute weight, how to rescue someone who had fallen through. Other communities seem to have approached each winter anew, learning its particular challenges through painful trial and error. You cross successfully, though one heart-stopping moment near the far bank nearly sends you plunging into water that would certainly mean hypothermia and possibly death. The adrenaline warms you briefly, then fades, leaving you shaking and more cautious as you continue. The miles accumulate slowly. Your legs develop the deep ache of sustained effort. Your feet grow numb despite the grass stuffing. Your face burns from the cold wind that picks up as you climb out of the creek valley onto higher ground. You stop twice to rest, finding sheltered spots where you can eat some of the bread and cheese you carried, drink water from a flask you keep inside your coat to prevent freezing. By early afternoon you can see the neighbouring settlement in the distance, a cluster of buildings gathered around a crossroads, smoke rising from chimneys, a church steeple pointing toward the grey sky. The sight lifts your spirits considerably. You have made it. Whatever news awaits, whatever the return journey will demand, you have successfully completed one half of the venture. The settlement proves quiet but not deserted. A few people move between buildings, conducting the ordinary business of December survival. The tavern, every settlement has a tavern, shows signs of activity, and this is where you head, knowing that news concentrates where travellers gather. Inside, warmth envelops you like an embrace. The tavern's fire blazes magnificently, far larger than anything you could maintain in your own home, and the room is crowded with people seeking the same warmth and information you desire. You order a mug of cider, warm cider, spiced with something that might be cinnamon, and find a seat near enough to the fire to thaw your extremities. The news, when it comes, is not good. The war goes badly, Washington's army is dissolving. The British are comfortable in their winter quarters, confident of victory when spring allows renewed campaigning. Christmas is coming, and it may be the last Christmas of American independence. You sit by the fire, sipping your cider, letting the warmth seep into your bones. The journey home will be just as difficult as the journey here, and you will need to leave soon if you hope to arrive before dark. But for this moment, you rest, gathering strength for whatever comes next. You arrive home well after dark, exhausted from the return journey, but carrying something more valuable than any physical cargo: news, rumours, and the knowledge that the world beyond your immediate surroundings continues to turn. The fire has nearly died in your absence, and you spend the first hour rebuilding it, coaxing flames from embers, gradually restoring warmth to the cold house. Only then, with your fingers finally flexible enough to manage fine movements, do you begin to think about food. This is where the reality of colonial Christmas preparation begins to reveal itself. Whatever December celebration you might observe, and the question remains genuinely uncertain, will require food. Not just ordinary food, the daily sustenance of bread and stew and preserved vegetables, but special food, the kind of dishes that mark an occasion as different from regular days. And special food in 1776 cannot be prepared on short notice. It requires weeks of advance work, beginning now, if not earlier. The women of your household, and it is primarily women who bear this burden, as with so many burdens in colonial domestic life, have been preparing since autumn. The work began with harvest, with the preservation of fruits and vegetables that would otherwise rot before December arrived. Apples were dried in slices, strung on threads and hung near the fire until they became leathery and shrunken, capable of lasting through winter. Pumpkins and squash were stored whole in the root cellar, their hard rinds protecting the flesh within. Corn was dried and ground into meal, a staple that would stretch through lean months. The meat preservation started even earlier, or rather, it constitutes an ongoing process that intensifies as December approaches. Pigs slaughtered in November have been transformed into hams and bacon through smoking, into sausages through grinding and stuffing, into head cheese and scrapple through the salvaging of every usable part. A colonial family wastes nothing. The blood becomes blood pudding. The intestines become sausage casings. The fat is rendered into lard for cooking and soap making. The bones are cracked for marrow and then boiled for stock. Every scrap of the animal serves some purpose. You help bring more wood inside, stacking it near the hearth where it will dry further, and be ready for tomorrow's fires. As you work, your spouse describes the day's kitchen activities, the grinding of spices, the mixing of doughs, the careful checking of preserved goods for signs of spoilage, and these are not glamorous tasks. They do not appear in the romantic depictions of colonial Christmas that later centuries will create. They are simply necessary, the unglamorous labour that makes any celebration possible. The baking process alone requires staggering amounts of preparation. Your oven, a brick chamber built into the side of the fireplace, must be heated by burning wood inside it for hours, until the bricks absorb enough heat to cook whatever goes in next. This means calculating backwards from when you want the finished product. A batch of bread might require 4 hours of preheating, then several hours of baking, then time for the oven to cool before the next batch can begin. Complex baking days are exercises in logistics, scheduling different items according to their temperature requirements, trying to extract maximum productivity from each oven heating. Historians still argue whether colonial families actually baked special Christmas treats or whether the holiday foods we associate with the era are largely 19th century innovations projected backward. Evidence exists for both positions. Some household records mention specific December baking projects, suggesting that at least some families mark the season with particular foods. Other records show no distinction between December and any other month, suggesting that the holiday's special status had not yet extended to culinary practices. What seems certain is that any December feast required substantial advance planning. The ingredients themselves pose challenges that modern cooks cannot easily imagine. Sugar, if you had it at all, came in dense cones that had to be chipped and ground before use. Flour required sifting through multiple grades of mesh to remove impurities that would ruin texture. Spices, cinnamon, nutmeg, ginger, were expensive imports that had to be carefully rationed, used sparingly to stretch limited supplies through the year. You sit down to supper, eating the same stew you have eaten variations of for weeks. The meat is salted beef, tough and intensely flavoured, requiring hours of simmering to become chewable. The vegetables are root crops, turnips, parsnips, carrots that have turned woody with storage but still provide bulk and sustenance. The bread is coarse, made from rye flour mixed with a little precious wheat, dense enough to serve as a weapon if thrown hard. None of this is festive. None of it suggests Christmas is approaching. It is simply dinner, the fuel your body needs to survive another December day. Yet the preparations for something better continue in the background. Somewhere in the root cellar, a small stock of finer ingredients awaits its moment. The dried fruit set aside for holiday baking, the nuts hoarded since autumn, the molasses jug, carefully sealed, that will sweeten whatever treats the household manages to produce. These resources are limited, and there will be no opportunity to replenish them until trade routes reopen in spring. Whatever Christmas feast emerges must come from what already exists on hand. The drinking preparations require separate consideration. Colonial Americans consumed alcohol at rates that would alarm modern physicians, but December celebrations demanded even more than usual. Cider was the baseline, pressed from autumn apples and allowed to ferment into something ranging from mildly alcoholic to seriously potent depending on how long it aged. Rum was a popular addition, imported from Caribbean sugar plantations and mixed into various punches and warmers. Those with access to grains might brew beer, though the process was time-consuming and the results variable. One quirky tradition that has been described to you involves something called wassail, a hot drink combining cider, spices, and often roasted apples that served both as refreshment and as the centerpiece of singing traditions. Wassailers, groups of singers, would travel from house to house, offering songs in exchange for drinks from the household's wassail bowl. The practice was more common in England than in the American colonies, where Puritan influence had suppressed such customs, but pockets of wassailing tradition survived, particularly in areas with strong Anglican or continental European populations. You finish your stew and sit back, feeling the food settle into your stomach. The fire has rebuilt to comfortable levels, casting dancing shadows across the room. Outside, the December darkness presses against the oiled paper windows, absolute and complete. There is no moon tonight, no stars visible through the cloud cover that rolled in during the afternoon. The world beyond your door might as well not exist. Tomorrow the food preparation will continue. There will be more drying, more grinding, more careful checking of stores. There will be discussions about what the household can afford to set aside for celebration versus what must be consumed immediately for survival. There will be the constant calculations that colonial life demands, balancing present needs against future hopes, immediate hunger against the desire for something special to mark the season. Christmas in 1776 is not a single day, but a process, gradual accumulation of effort that might, if circumstances allow, culminate in a meal that rises slightly above the ordinary. The romantic vision of colonial Christmas, with its groaning tables and abundant cheer, obscures the weeks of labour that any feast required, labour performed by people who had no guarantees the feast would actually happen. Illness, accident, spoilage, or simple exhaustion could derail any preparation at any moment. The celebration, if it came, would be earned through countless hours of work. You yawn, the exhaustion of travel, finally catching up with you. The bed awaits, cold until body heat warms the blankets, uncomfortable by any modern standard, but infinitely better than the alternative of no bed at all. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges, its own demands, its own small victories and defeats in the endless struggle to survive. For now, you rest by the fire, letting the warmth soak into muscles sore from miles of walking. The preparations continue in the back of your mind even as sleep approaches. Christmas is coming, among whatever that means, and you will meet it as you meet everything else, with work, with endurance, with the stubborn refusal to surrender that defines colonial existence. Morning finds you standing at the hearth, watching your spouse navigate the daily miracle of colonial cooking. This is not the gentle art of following recipes with measured ingredients and reliable temperatures. This is combat, a continuous battle against fire, smoke, and and the complete absence of anything resembling modern kitchen conveniences. The process demands skills that modern cooks would find utterly foreign, skills developed through years of practice and passed down through generations of kitchen workers. The fire itself requires constant attention. Unlike a modern stove with its adjustable dials and predictable heat output, the hearth flame fluctuates continuously, responding to air currents, wood quality, and its own mysterious internal dynamics. A pot that was simmering gently 5 minutes ago might be boiling violently now, or might have cooled to barely warm. The cook must monitor, adjust and readjust constantly, moving pots closer to or farther from the flames, raising or lowering them on the various hooks and chains that dangle from the chimney's interior. You watch as your spouse manages 3 separate cooking operations simultaneously. A large iron kettle hangs at the back of the fire, maintaining the perpetual stew that serves as the household's primary protein source. Closer to the flames, a smaller pot contains water heating for purposes that might include washing, cooking, or simply warming cold hands. On the hearth itself, a Dutch oven sits buried in hot coals, its lid covered with additional coals, creating an enclosed baking environment that substitutes for the larger brick oven when only small quantities are needed. The tools of colonial cooking appear primitive but represent sophisticated engineering for their era. The long-handled pans and pots keep the cook's arms away from the flames, reducing, though not eliminating, the risk of burns. The various hooks, trammels and cranes allow for height adjustment without requiring direct contact with hot metal. The Dutch oven's design, heavy iron with a flanged lid that holds coals, creates an effective portable oven that can bake bread, roast meat, or prepare almost anything a brick oven could manage. Historians still argue whether colonial women developed these cooking skills through formal instruction or through trial and error apprenticeship. Some evidence suggests organised teaching, mothers passing knowledge to daughters, older servants training younger ones. Other evidence points to a more chaotic learning process, with young cooks making mistakes, wasting food, and occasionally burning down houses before developing competence. The risks are not trivial. Colonial cooking kills and maims with disturbing regularity. Women's long skirts catch fire, turning a moment's inattention into tragedy. Scalding liquids splash from pots that tip or burst. Heavy iron implements fall, breaking bones and crushing fingers. The kitchen, if you can call this corner of the main room a kitchen, is the most dangerous space in the house, and the person who spends the most time there faces risks that would trigger immediate OSHA intervention in any modern workplace. You cannot help directly with the cooking. Gender roles in colonial America are rigid, and cooking falls into the female sphere as firmly as ploughing falls into the male, but you can help indirectly, fetching water and wood, holding implements when an extra hand is needed, keeping children and animals away from the fire's immediate vicinity. These supporting roles free the cook to focus on the tasks that require her accumulated expertise. Today's challenge involves bread, specifically the dense loaves that will sustain the household through the coming week. Bread making in colonial America is not the casual hobby it has become in modern kitchens, with their stand mixers and instant yeast. It is a multi-day process that begins with the preparation of a starter, a fermented mixture that provides the leavening power that makes bread rise. The starter has been developing for 2 days, fed with flour and water, kept warm enough to encourage fermentation, but not so warm that the wrong microorganisms take over. This morning it looks right, bubbly, slightly sour-smelling, active and ready to leaven a batch of dough. Your spouse mixes it with more flour, water and a precious pinch of salt, working the mass with hands that have performed this action thousands of times before. The kneading takes perhaps 15 minutes, though no one is watching a clock. The dough transforms under practiced hands, becoming smoother, more elastic, developing the gluten structure that will trap gases and create the bread's texture. Too little kneading produces dense, heavy loaves. Too much produces tough, chewy bread that no amount of butter can rescue. The right amount comes from experience, from a feel that cannot be taught through words alone. While the dough rises, set near the fire, but not too close, covered with a cloth to retain warmth, attention shifts to other tasks. There is always something else to cook, something else to prepare, something else to preserve or check or adjust. The stew needs stirring, the water needs watching. The Dutch oven needs rotating so its contents cook evenly. The fire needs feeding with just enough wood to maintain temperature without flaring dangerously. One quirky aspect of colonial cooking that modern practitioners often overlook is the complete absence of standardized measurements. Recipes, when they exist at all, call for some flour, enough water, a bit of salt. Successful cooking depends not on following precise instructions, but on understanding how ingredients should look, feel, and behave at each stage of preparation. A cook knows the bread is ready when it has risen enough, not when a timer sounds. The brick oven requires separate preparation. While the bread dough rises, someone must build a fire inside the oven chamber, burning wood until the bricks glow with absorbed heat. This takes hours. Starting the oven fire for evening bread must happen by mid-morning at the latest. The smoke and flames that pour from the oven mouth during heating add another hazard to an already dangerous workspace. When the bricks reach proper temperature, judged by colour, by how quickly a flour sprinkle browns, by accumulated experience, the fire must be raked out, the oven floor swept clean of ash, and the bread loaded quickly before too much heat escapes. The oven door closes, and then begins the anxious wait. No thermometer tells you the internal temperature, no timer tells you when to check. You wait until experience suggests the bread might be done, then open the door and test, tapping the bottom of a loaf, listening for the hollow sound that indicates proper baking. By early afternoon, the bread emerges. 4 loaves of varying success, where 2 are excellent, well risen and properly browned. 1 is acceptable, slightly dense but certainly edible. 1 is an outright failure, collapsed in the centre, probably from a draft that cooled the oven too quickly. This failure rate is normal. Colonial cooking produces inconsistent results even from experienced cooks, and the expectation of occasional failure is built into household planning. You make more than you need, knowing some portion will not turn out. The successful loaves cool on a wooden rack, their crusts crackling as they contract. The smell fills the house, that primordial baking bread aroma that humans have found comforting for millennia. Even failure cannot entirely spoil the pleasure of fresh bread after days of eating the increasingly stale remains of the previous batch. You help carry the failure loaf outside where it will be broken up and fed to the chickens. Nothing is wasted. Even failed bread provides nutrition for animals whose eggs and eventual meat will feed the household. The cycle continues. Waste becoming food, becoming more waste, becoming more food. An endless loop of consumption and production that sustains colonial life. The day's cooking continues, but the most demanding task is complete. The bread will last perhaps a week, stored in a covered basket that slows, though cannot prevent, starling. By next week, the process will repeat. Starter cultivation, kneading, rising, heating, baking, the endless rhythm of keeping a household fed. Your spouse wipes sweat from her forehead. The fire's heat makes the kitchen area nearly tropical, even in December, and begins planning tomorrow's challenges. There is always more to do. Colonial cooking never ends, never pauses, never allows the luxury of ordering takeout or running to a store. Everything consumed must be produced, and production never stops. You think about what all this means for Christmas. Any special holiday food will require additional labour on top of this baseline, additional effort squeezed from days already full. The celebration, if it happens, will not appear magically. It will be earned through hours of hot, dangerous, exhausting work. Evening settles over the household and you gather with your family around the table for supper. The candle, just one for economy, casts a small pool of yellow light, leaving the room's corners in shadow. The food before you represents the culmination of the day's cooking efforts. Bread still fresh enough to be soft, stew thick with root vegetables and salted meat, a small dish of preserved fruit that constitutes tonight's special treat. This is what December eating looks like in 1776, and if you're honest with yourself, it could be considerably worse. The meal proceeds quietly, conversation requires energy, and by evening most household members have expended their daily allotment. Spoons scrape against wooden trenchers, bread is torn and dipped. The stew disappears steadily, its warmth spreading through bodies that have been fighting cold since dawn. Outside, the wind has picked up, rattling the shutters and finding every gap in the houses in perfect construction. You think about what a Christmas feast might contain, assembling the possibilities from memory and hearsay. The centerpiece, if you could manage it, would be some form of roasted meat, ideally a goose, though chicken, pork or even venison might substitute, depending on what was available. Geese are traditional Christmas birds in England. their fat providing flavour and their size providing enough meat for a gathering. But geese require keeping through the year, feeding and protecting until December's slaughter, and the war has disrupted such long-term planning. The side dishes would depend entirely on what the root cellar contained. Turnips, certainly, prepared in any number of ways. Mashed, roasted, added to soups. Parsnips, sweeter after frost exposure, could be roasted alongside meat until their edges caramelised. Carrots, if any survived this long into winter, would add colour to an otherwise brown and beige palette. The ever-present cabbage, whether fresh pickled or preserved in sauerkraut by German neighbours, would provide both bulk and a sharpness to cut through fatty meats. Bread would anchor the meal, probably something finer than the daily loaves, perhaps wheat flour instead of rye, perhaps enriched with eggs and butter to create something approaching modern ideas of holiday bread. The German settlers, you have heard, bake special breads for Christmas, stolen, dense with dried fruits and nuts, or braided loaves shaped into symbolic forms. English tradition favours Christmas pudding, that mysterious steamed confection of suet, dried fruit, and spices that apparently requires weeks of aging to develop proper flavour. Historians still argue whether colonial Americans of 1776 actually prepared such elaborate dishes, or whether the documented feasts represent exceptional circumstances that have been mistakenly generalised. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Some families, in some years, under some circumstances, managed impressive Christmas spreads, while others marked the day with meals barely distinguishable from any other winter supper. The question of what people actually ate versus what they aspired to eat remains challenging for historians to answer. Definitively, household records often list only unusual expenditures, not ordinary meals, creating a skewed picture that emphasises special occasions. Letters and diaries mention particularly memorable feasts while passing over forgettable daily eating. The archaeological record can identify what foods were present in a household through bone fragments, seed remains and other organic traces, but cannot specify when those foods were consumed. You finish your stew and reach for more bread, tearing a chunk from the fresh loaf and using it to chase the last bits of liquid from your trencher. The preserved fruit is dried apples, rehydrated in cooking and sweetened with molasses. The texture is strange. Nothing like fresh apples, more like a chewy, intensely flavoured substitute, but the sweetness provides welcome contrast to the savoury stew. One particularly odd Christmas food that has been mentioned to you is mincemeat, a mixture of minced meat, suet, dried fruits and toned spices that is preserved in jars and used to fill pies. The name suggests meat-forward preparation, but apparently the modern trend, if you can call it modern in 1776, is moving toward versions that contain no actual meat, relying on suet alone for richness. The tradition supposedly dates back centuries, when the spices and preserved fruits in mincemeat were expensive luxuries, making mincemeat pie a status symbol, as well as a seasonal treat. The transition from main course to what might generously be called dessert involves simply shifting attention from the stew pot to whatever sweet items the household possesses. Tonight, the dried apples are it. No pies, no cakes, no elaborate confections. The sugar supply is too precious for casual use, and the labour required to produce proper desserts exceeds what anyone can manage after a full day of survival tasks. Perhaps, if Christmas actually arrives with any sense of occasion, something sweeter will emerge. For now, this is sufficient. You think about drinking, not because you particularly want to drink, but because drinking constitutes such a fundamental part of colonial life that any meal description would be incomplete without it. The cider on the table is 2 months old, fermented from October's apple pressing, sharp and slightly fizzy with a modest alcohol content. Everyone drinks it, you, your spouse, any children present, any guests or workers who share the meal. The alternative, water, remains too risky for daily consumption. Its invisible contaminants causing illnesses that colonial medicine cannot or what treat. The stronger drinks come out after supper, as the evening entertainment for those who choose to partake. Rum is the preference of many, imported from Caribbean islands, and consumed in quantities that would stagger modern sensibilities. A working man might drink a half pint of rum daily, without anyone considering him particularly intemperate. Added to cider, it creates a warming punch that makes winter evenings more bearable. Added to hot water with sugar and spices, it becomes something approaching medicine, prescribed for ailments ranging from colds to depression. The meal winds down, dishes are cleared, and the evening's quiet hours begin. This is the time for mending, for small crafts, for whatever domestic tasks can be accomplished by firelight without requiring full attention. You sit near the hearth, working on a piece of leather that needs repair, while your spouse takes up knitting, the endless knitting that produces socks, mittens, and other necessities faster than wear destroys them. The food you ate tonight will fuel tomorrow's labour. The body burns calories with astonishing speed in winter, fighting cold, performing physical tasks, simply maintaining internal temperature against the relentless chill. Modern people, living in climate-controlled environments and moving from heated house to heated car to heated office, cannot easily imagine how many calories manual labour in cold weather demands. Colonial Americans ate what seemed like enormous quantities by modern standards, yet few grew fat. The calories went out as fast as they came in. Christmas, when it arrives, will demand its own culinary response. The feast, if feast there is, will represent not indulgence but necessity, a caloric reserve against the lean days of late winter, when stores run lowest. The tradition of holiday eating makes practical sense in this context. Stock up now, while food remains relatively abundant, against the coming months when preservation falters and spring seems impossibly distant. You set down your leatherwork as drowsiness overtakes you. The meal has done its job, providing warmth and energy and the simple satisfaction of hunger addressed. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges, its own meals, its own small victories and defeats. But for now, the fire crackles, the wind howls outside, and you allow yourself to imagine, just for a moment, what a real Christmas feast might taste like. The fire has burned low, casting just enough light to navigate toward the bed, and you find yourself thinking about drink, not the cider you had with supper, but the broader role of alcohol in colonial American life. This December, like every December, will be soaked in spirits to an extent that modern sensibilities would find alarming. The drinking culture of 1776 is not a peripheral aspect of daily existence. It is woven into the fabric of colonial society so thoroughly that attempting to separate them would be like trying to remove salt from seawater. You settle into the cold bed, pulling blankets up to your chin, waiting for body heat to gradually transform the frigid linens into something bearable. Your thoughts drift across the various alcoholic beverages that flow through colonial life, each with its own cultural context, its own social meaning, its own particular role in the rhythm of daily existence. Cider is the foundation, the baseline, the beverage that children drink alongside adults because the alternative, water, is simply too dangerous. Apple orchards exist throughout the colonies, some dating back to the earliest settlements, and the annual cider pressing transforms temporary abundance into year-round refreshment. Every household that has access to apples makes cider, storing it in barrels that slowly transform fresh sweet juice into something tangy, alcoholic, and reasonably safe from microbial contamination. The alcohol in cider, typically 3 to 8%, kills most waterborne pathogens while remaining weak enough for everyday consumption. A colonial family might drink a gallon of cider per day without anyone raising eyebrows. Children receive diluted portions, but they receive portions nonetheless. The concept of an alcohol-free childhood simply does not exist in colonial America, and no one sees anything remarkable about serving beer or cider to toddlers. Rum represents the step up from cider, the drink that transforms ordinary evenings into something more festive and ordinary meals into something more memorable. The rum trade is one of the most important commercial activities in colonial America, part of the notorious triangular trade that connects New England distilleries, Caribbean sugar plantations, and African slave markets. You try not to think too hard about where the rum comes from, or what human suffering underwrites its production. Most people do not think about it at all. A typical worker in colonial America might consume anywhere from a quarter pint to a full pint of rum daily, often mixed with water to create grog, or with cider to create various punches. Employers frequently provide rum as part of workers' compensation, understanding that labour without liquid refreshment is labour that will slow, falter, and eventually cease. Barn raisings, harvests, road building, and any communal work project includes communal drinking as a matter of course. Historians still argue whether colonial drinking rates were genuinely as high as documentary evidence suggests or whether observers exaggerated for rhetorical effect. The temperance movement of later centuries had strong motivations to paint colonial America as a sodden cautionary tale. Yet multiple independent sources, personal diaries, commercial records, travellers' accounts, consistently describe alcohol consumption at levels that would qualify as severe alcoholism by modern medical standards. You shift under the blankets, finding a position that minimises contact with the still cold outer edges of the mattress. The darkness is nearly complete now, the fire reduced to embers that provide warmth but little light. In this darkness, your thoughts continue to wander through the landscape of colonial drinking. Beer occupies a middle ground between cider and rum, more substantial than the former, but less intoxicating than the latter. Brewing requires grain, equipment and expertise that not every household possesses, making beer more of a commercial product than a home production in many areas. Taverns brew their own, selling by the tankard to patrons who gather for drink, warmth, news and companionship. The tavern is perhaps the most important social institution in colonial America, serving functions that modern society distributes among bars, restaurants, hotels, community centres and social media platforms. December drinking intensifies the already saturated baseline. Whatever celebration occurs, Christmas, New Year's, or simply the need to survive the darkest weeks of the year, alcohol provides both physical warmth and psychological relief. Punch bowls appear at gatherings, their contents varying by region, wealth and preference. A wealthy household might offer punch combining rum, citrus juice, sugar, pepper and spices, an expensive concoction featuring imported ingredients. A modest household might offer simple rum and cider, mixed in proportions that depend on what's available. One peculiar drinking tradition that has filtered down through various sources involves something called a flip, a winter warmer made by thrusting a red-hot iron poker into a mixture of beer, rum and sugar. The heated iron caramelizes the sugars, creates a frothy head, and warms the drink to near-boiling temperatures. The practice sounds almost performative, the sizzle and steam of metal meeting liquid, and apparently constitutes entertainment as much as refreshment. The wassail tradition, mentioned earlier in your memories of the German settlers and their customs, takes on added significance in this context. Wassail is not merely a drink, but a social practice, a ritualized form of the neighborhood bonding that combines alcohol, music, and mutual obligation. The wassailers sing, the householder provides drink, both parties fulfill their roles in a community drama that reinforces social connections during the isolating months of winter. December 1776 will feature all of this drinking, and more provided the supplies hold out. The war has disrupted trade routes, making rum harder to obtain in some areas, but local cider production continues regardless of political circumstances. Apples do not care who wins the revolution, and neither do the yeasts that transform their juice into something stronger. You wonder, drifting towards sleep, whether George Washington and his soldiers will drink anything special on Christmas Day. The Continental Army's situation is desperate, supplies minimal, morale crumbling, but even desperate soldiers find ways to acquire alcohol. The rum ration has been a military tradition for generations, and commanders who fail to provide it risk mutiny more surely than commanders who lose battles. Perhaps the soldiers will toast the holiday with whatever they can scrounge, lifting cups toward a future that seems increasingly uncertain. The drinking culture of colonial America reflects something deeper than mere thirst or desire for intoxication. It reflects an understanding of alcohol as food, as medicine, as social glue, as spiritual comfort. The idea that one might choose not to drink, might abstain by preference rather than poverty, would strike most colonists as bizarre, suspicious, perhaps even sinful. God gave humanity grain and fruit. Humans transformed them into beer and cider and wine. Refusing these gifts would be almost ungrateful. Your eyes close, but consciousness lingers a moment longer. The warmth of the bed has finally become noticeable, your body heat pushing back the chill. Tomorrow you will drink cider with breakfast, perhaps rum with dinner if supplies allow, continuing the endless flow of alcohol that defines colonial existence. Tonight you simply rest, letting the day's accumulated fatigue pull you towards sleep. The drinking will resume in the morning, it always does. You wake to a morning so cold that ice has formed on the inside of the window, not just on the glass, but on the oiled paper covering, creating a crystalline layer that filters the grey dawn light into something almost beautiful. The first order of business, as always, is fire. You stumble toward the hearth, breath visible in the frigid air, and begin the ritual of coaxing warmth from the banked coals. As the flames catch and grow, you turn your attention to clothing. This is not the casual process modern people experience, selecting items from closets full of options. Dressing in colonial America is an engineering project, a careful layering of materials designed to trap body heat against the relentless cold. What you wear today will determine whether you merely suffer or actually risk frostbite during the day's outdoor work. The base layer is linen, the fabric touching your skin. Linen seems counterintuitive for winter. It is a plant fibre, crisp and cool to the touch, but its wicking properties actually serve useful purposes, drawing moisture away from the body and preventing the clammy dampness that accelerates heat loss. You pull on a linen shirt long enough to tuck into breeches, its weave loose enough to allow air circulation while still providing a foundation for warmer layers above. Over the shirt comes wool, always wool. The fibre that sheep produce has been keeping humans warm for thousands of years, and despite centuries of textile innovation, nothing surpasses it for the combination of warmth, moisture management and durability that winter demands. Your waistcoat is wool, closely fitted to trap air near your torso. Your outer coat is heavier wool, woven more densely, capable of blocking wind even when temperatures drop toward freezing. The breeches deserve particular attention. Colonial men do not wear long trousers as modern men do. The style of 1776 features knee-length breeches that leave the lower leg exposed to whatever stockings can provide. In summer, this arrangement is perfectly comfortable. In December, it represents a significant vulnerability. You pull on thick woolen stockings that reach above the knee, overlapping with the breeches' bottoms, creating a continuous barrier of fabric between skin and air. Historians still argue whether colonial Americans wore anything resembling modern underwear. The evidence is mixed and somewhat confusing. Linen drawers existed and were worn by some men, but they were not universal. Women wore various undergarments, stays, petticoats, shifts, but the concept of underwear, as we understand it, remained in development. What seems clear is that layers mattered more than specific garments. Whether a particular layer was called underwear or clothing mattered less than its contribution to overall warmth. You add more layers as the morning progresses, a neckcloth wrapped around your throat covering the vulnerable area where cold air can penetrate. A hat, wool or felt, that traps heat radiating from your head. Gloves or mittens, depending on whether you need finger dexterity for your work. The complete ensemble makes movement slightly awkward, each joint requiring extra effort to bend through multiple fabric layers. This is acceptable. Awkward but warm beats nimble but frozen. The materials available for colonial clothing represent centuries of accumulated knowledge about cold weather survival. Wool's dominance is no accident. The fiber's structure creates tiny air pockets that provide insulation, and it retains warmth even when wet, a crucial property in climates where precipitation and perspiration both threaten to dampen clothing. Linen serves its base layer role because earlier generations discovered, through trial and error, that it manages moisture better than wool against the skin. Leather appears wherever extraordinary durability is needed. Boots, of course, but also work aprons, heavy gloves, and various straps and fastenings. Leather is expensive. Transforming animal hide into usable material requires the tanning process, a time-consuming and foul-smelling operation that most households cannot perform themselves. But leather lasts, resisting wear that would quickly destroy fabric alternatives, and the investment pays off over years of use. Your boots represent one of your more valuable possessions. They were made by a cobbler 2 towns distant, custom fitted to your feet through a process involving careful measurements and wooden lasts carved to your specific shape. The leather is thick, treated with oil to resist water, and the soles are attached with small wooden pegs rather than thread that might rot. Inside today, you have stuffed dry grass for additional insulation, practice that sounds primitive but actually works remarkably well, creating an air barrier between your stockings and the cold ground. Animal furs provide the warmest materials of all, though their expense limits them to the wealthy or those who hunt and trap their own. A fur-lined coat or cape offers luxury-level warmth that mere wool cannot match. Fur hats, particularly beaver felt, provide excellent protection for heads and ears, but most colonists make do with what they can afford, which means wool and more wool layered and overlapped until the body's heat can finally accumulate. One quirky detail about colonial clothing that surprises modern people: the lack of buttons as we know them. Metal buttons exist but are expensive. More common are fabric-covered forms, lacing, hooks and eyes, or simple ties that hold garments closed. Getting dressed takes time, each closure requiring individual attention, each layer adding to the complexity. The quick change of modern life, stripping off one outfit and jumping into another, does not exist in colonial America. Dressing and undressing are deliberate processes that bookend the day. You are finally ready to face the December morning, armoured in fabric against the cold that waits beyond the door. The fire has rebuilt itself to reasonable levels. The house is warmed enough that movement is possible without shivering. You eat a quick breakfast, fuel for the work ahead, then take a breath and step outside. The cold strikes immediately, finding every gap in your layered defences, the spaces between glove and sleeve, the tiny opening where your neckcloth has shifted, the boot's tops where stockings end. These vulnerabilities will demand constant attention throughout the day. You will adjust, rewrap, retuck and readjust as clothing shifts and gaps open. Staying warm is not a state you achieve and maintain, it is an active process, a continuous negotiation with the cold. The work begins. There are animals to tend, water to haul, wood to split. Each task generates heat that your clothing traps, gradually warming you from the inside. But each task also exposes you to the cold in different ways, requiring you to balance productivity against self-preservation. Work too hard and you sweat. The moisture penetrates your clothing and freezes during the rest periods. Work too slowly and you never generate enough heat to stay comfortable. This is the reality of colonial winter clothing, not a perfect solution but a workable compromise. A system that allows survival and labour without providing actual comfort. The cold is always present, always probing, always ready to punish any lapse in vigilance. Your clothing holds it at bay mostly, most of the time, if you are careful and lucky and smart. You swing the axe, splitting another log, feeling the impact travel up your arms. The exertion warms you. The cold presses back. The dance continues. The same dance your ancestors have danced for generations. The same dance your descendants will dance until someone invents central heating and synthetic insulation and all the other technologies that will eventually make winter merely inconvenient rather than life-threatening. For now, in December 1776, you simply dress as warmly as you can and get to work. The afternoon brings a visitor, your neighbour from the adjacent farmstead, a man named Hendricks, who stops by perhaps once a week to exchange news and check that you have not died of cold or accident, or any of the other hazards that claim colonial lives. He stamps his boots at your doorstep, knocking off the frozen mud, and you welcome him into the warmth of your home with genuine pleasure. Company in December is precious. The isolation of winter presses on the mind as surely as the cold presses on the body. Hendricks settles near the fire, accepting the mug of warm cider you offer, and the conversation turns, as it often does, to economics. Money, or rather the chronic lack of it, shapes colonial life in ways that modern people, accustomed to cash and credit and complex financial systems, can scarcely imagine. You are not poor by the standards of your community, but you are certainly not wealthy. And the distinction between survival and prosperity often comes down to calculations you would rather not make. The household economy of 1776 operates on principles that would baffle modern accountants. Cash is genuinely scarce. Actual coins, whether British pounds or Spanish dollars or any of the various currencies circulating through the colonies, and most transactions occur through barter, credit, or labour exchange. Hendricks needs help repairing his barn roof. You need several pounds of nails. No money changes hands, but both needs get addressed through an informal accounting system that tracks debts and credits across the community. This system requires trust. Everyone in your settlement knows everyone else, knows who pays their debts and who does not, knows who can be relied upon and who makes promises they cannot keep. Reputation is currency, as valuable as any coin, and a single default can ruin a family's economic standing for generations. The pressure to honour obligations, financial, social, moral, creates a web of mutual dependence that modern individualism has largely dissolved. The war has complicated everything. Continental currency, paper money, issued by the revolutionary government has been losing value at an alarming rate. Historians will later calculate that continental dollars depreciated by roughly 80% during 1776 alone, and the phrase "not worth a continental" will enter the language as a synonym for worthlessness. Accepting payment in continental currency has become a gamble. The money might buy something today but be nearly worthless by next week. Hendricks mentions that a merchant in the nearest town is refusing to accept paper money entirely, demanding payment in hard currency or goods. This is technically illegal. Laws require acceptance of continental money, but enforcement is impossible in practical terms. The merchant calculates that legal penalties are less damaging than accepting money that may become worthless before he can spend it. Such calculations multiply across the colonial economy, each actor making individual decisions that collectively undermine the financial system Congress is trying to establish. You think about what any December celebration will cost, running mental calculations through the peculiar math of colonial economics. A goose, if you could find one for sale, might run 5 shillings, but 5 shillings in what currency? In British coins, that represents a meaningful but manageable expense. In continental paper, it might require a wheelbarrow full of bills that will be worth even less by the time you try to spend them. The truth is that most of your Christmas provisions will come not from purchases, but from stores already accumulated. The preserved meats, dried fruits, and root vegetables in your cellar represent months of labour converted into material form. You will not buy ingredients for a Christmas feast. You will assemble them from what you already possess, transforming preserved wealth into temporary celebration. Historians still argue whether colonial Americans understood concepts like inflation in the technical economic sense, or simply experienced rising prices as a frustrating mystery. The evidence suggests something in between. Colonial merchants and farmers clearly recognized that paper money was losing value, and they adjusted their behavior accordingly. But the sophisticated economic theories explaining why this happened would not be fully developed for another century or more. Hendricks drains his cider and rises to leave. The light is fading and he needs to return home before dark. You walk him to the door, exchanging the ritual farewells that mark the end of a visit, pleasantries about weather, hopes for continued health, vague plans to meet again soon. The door closes behind him, and you are alone again with your household and your thoughts. The economics of survival weigh on you as evening approaches. Everything costs something, even things that seem free. The firewood burning in your hearth represents labour and time. The food in your cellar represents investment in seeds, soil, and countless hours of cultivation and preservation. The clothes on your back represent raw materials transformed through skills learned over years of practice. Nothing comes from nothing. Every comfort must be paid for in one currency or another. This is why any December celebration feels significant beyond its religious or cultural meaning. A feast represents surplus, an expenditure beyond bare necessity, evidence that the household has accumulated enough to afford some small indulgence. In a world of chronic scarcity, where most people live close to the edge of survival, any celebration announces, "We have made it this far, we have enough to spare, we can look toward the future with something other than desperation." The financial pressure of war makes such celebrations even more fraught. Every expenditure carries risk in uncertain times. The ham you eat at Christmas might have been sold for currency that could buy necessities later. The candles you burn for festive lighting might have been traded for something more practical. The opportunity costs multiply with each decision, each small indulgence weighed against possible future need. You check the stores in your cellar, counting and recounting the preserved goods that will determine what the winter holds. There is enough probably to last until spring if nothing goes wrong. But nothing goes wrong is a condition that rarely holds for long in colonial America. Illness, accident, fire, theft, stealage, any of these could transform sufficiency into desperate shortage overnight. This is the economic reality that shapes your December. Not poverty exactly, but precariousness. The constant awareness that the margin between survival and disaster remains uncomfortably thin. Whatever celebration you manage will be flavoured by this awareness, by gratitude for what you have, tempered by anxiety about what might be lost. The fire crackles, the candle flickers, and another December evening begins its slow progress toward morning. The children are restless. You can see it in their movements, the way they fidget during meals and find excuses to peer out the window at a landscape that offers nothing new to see. December is hard on children, hard on everyone really, but perhaps especially hard on young people whose energy finds few outlets in the confined spaces of winter life. There are no Christmas presents coming, no advent calendars counting down the days, no elaborate holiday preparations that promise excitement. There is only the cold, the work, and the endless waiting for spring. You watch your oldest child, a girl of perhaps 10 years, as she helps with the evening's tasks. Her movements are competent but mechanical, learned through repetition rather than inspired by interest. She cards wool, drawing the fibres through metal-toothed paddles, until they align into fluffy bats ready for spinning. This is not play. This is labour. Real work that contributes to the household's survival. Children in Colonial. America are not protected from work. They are expected to contribute as soon as they are able, which means earlier than modern sensibilities would consider appropriate. The concept of childhood as a protected phase of development, separate from the demands of adult life, barely exists in 76. Children are small adults, incomplete versions of the people they will become, learning the skills they will need through direct participation in adult activities. A girl learns to cook by cooking, to sew by sewing, to manage a household by observing, and gradually assuming her mother's responsibilities. A boy learns to farm by farming, to manage livestock by managing livestock, to conduct business by watching his father negotiate. This does not mean colonial parents are cruel or indifferent to their children's well-being. Love exists. The diaries and letters of the period overflow with parental affection, but it coexists with expectations that strike modern observers as harsh. Children work. Because everyone works, because survival demands contribution from every household member regardless of age, because idleness is neither affordable nor virtuous. The younger children are easier to occupy, or perhaps harder depending on your perspective. Too young for meaningful work, they must be supervised and entertained during the long winter hours when outdoor play is impossible. You tell stories, the same stories your parents told you, tales of biblical heroes and local legends, and cautionary warnings about what happens to children who disobey or wander into the woods alone. The stories serve multiple purposes: entertainment, moral instruction, cultural transmission, and the simple filling of time that would otherwise pass in restless boredom. Toys exist but are scarce. A wooden doll carved by some family member with skill and patience might serve a girl for years. A ball made from rays wrapped around a core of string provides endless games when weather permits outdoor play. Marbles, tops, hoops, simple objects that require little material but considerable imagination constitute the playthings of colonial childhood. There are no purchased toys in most households, no commercial products designed specifically to entertain children. Everything is homemade, handed down, adapted from whatever materials are available. Historians still argue whether colonial children were genuinely content with their limited diversions, or whether they experienced deprivation that contemporary sources simply do not record. Children leave few written records of their own thoughts. What we know comes primarily from adults observing or remembering childhood. These adult perspectives may romanticize or criticize, but they cannot capture the child's own experience. What seems clear is that expectations shape experience. Colonial children did not know what they were missing because there was nothing to miss. The elaborate entertainments of later centuries had not yet been invented. The commercial culture of childhood lay in the future. A wooden doll was not a poor substitute for a factory-made toy. It was simply what dolls were, the only kind anyone knew. December brings no special treats for colonial children, no anticipation of Santa Claus or Christmas morning unwrapping. If the household observes Christmas at all, the children might receive small gifts, an orange, a ribbon, a new pair of mittens. But these represent practical necessities rather than indulgences. The idea of Christmas as primarily a children's holiday, a day focused on presents and magic and wonder, will not develop for another half-century or more. Your daughter finishes her carding and sets aside the wool. She asks if there is anything else to be done, and you shake your head. The evening's work is complete. She retreats to a corner of the room, finding a scrap of fabric and some thread, practicing the embroidery stitches her mother has been teaching her. Even this apparent leisure serves. Practical purpose, embroidery skills will be needed when she manages her own household, and practice now makes competence later. The younger children settle near the fire, engaged in some game involving stones they have collected and marked with different symbols. The rules are opaque to adult observation, but the game seems to absorb them, and absorption is the goal. An absorbed child is a quiet child, and quiet children allow adults to rest briefly from the constant vigilance that young ones require. You think about what these children's future holds. If the revolution succeeds, they will grow up as citizens of a new nation, free from British rule, potentially free from the constraints that have shaped their parents' lives. If the revolution fails, they will grow up as colonial subjects, perhaps punished for their parents' rebellion, certainly shaped by defeat. Either way, they will face challenges you cannot predict. Wars, epidemics, economic upheavals, personal tragedies, and triumphs that remain hidden in the fog of future time. For now, they are simply children, doing what children, in all times and places do, learning, playing, testing limits, absorbing the culture around them through observation and participation. Their December is not magical or special, it is simply December. Another month in an endless succession of months, another set of days to survive, until something better arrives. You add a log to the fire and settle into your chair. The children's voices create a background murmur, half-heard words blending into something like music. This is family life in 1776, cramped, demanding, exhausting, and irreplaceable. Whatever Christmas brings, you will face it together. Sunday arrives, and with it the question that faces every colonial household. Church, you dress in your better clothes. Not significantly different from everyday wear, just cleaner and less patched. And contemplate the meaning of December's religious observances. The answer depends entirely on which religious tradition your family claims, and in 1796 that question opens onto a landscape of astonishing complexity. The walk to the nearest meeting house takes perhaps 40 minutes, long enough to thoroughly chill you despite your careful layering. The building itself is plain by any standard, a rectangular structure of weathered wood, painted neither white nor any other colour, with a simple steeple that holds a bell used to summon congregants from the surrounding farms. Inside, the arrangement is similarly austere. Wooden pews, a raised pulpit, no decoration beyond the functional requirements of conducting worship. This is a Congregationalist church, descended from the Puritan tradition that shaped New England and spread its influence into the middle colonies. The minister preaches for over an hour, his sermon focused on salvation and damnation, the constant struggle against sin, the need for individual transformation through God's grace. There is no mention of Christmas, no acknowledgement that December 25th approaches, no special observances planned. For this congregation, the day is like any other, perhaps slightly worse than ordinary days, given its association with the corrupt practices they fled Europe to escape. You listen, or try to listen, though the cold seeping through the building's inadequate walls makes concentration difficult. The meeting house has no heating. Congregants are expected to endure discomfort as part of worship, the physical suffering perhaps meant to focus minds on matters spiritual rather than bodily. Some people bring foot warmers, small boxes containing heated stones or coals, and the glow of these devices creates spots of relative comfort in an otherwise frigid space. The contrast with other December churches could not be more stark. You have heard of Anglican services in the southern colonies, conducted with prayer books and vestments and elaborate ritual that would scandalise your current minister. The Anglicans celebrate Christmas with enthusiasm, their churches decorated with evergreen boughs, their services featuring special music and readings marking the Saviour's birth. To them, December 25th is one of the holiest days of the year, second only to Easter in religious significance. Historians still argue whether the sharp denominational differences of 1776 represented genuine theological conviction or had become primarily cultural and political markers. The argument has merit on both sides. Some colonists clearly held deep beliefs that shaped their worship choices. Others seem to have attended whatever church was nearby, whatever church their neighbours attended, whatever church fit their social position without much consideration of doctrine. The German churches add another layer of complexity. Lutheran and Reformed congregations maintain their own Christmas traditions, singing carols in German, attending candlelit services on Christmas Eve, treating the holiday as an occasion for both solemn worship and joyful celebration. The Moravians, with their elaborate musical traditions and their putzes depicting the Nativity, approach Christmas with an artistic enthusiasm that might confuse or disturb more austere Protestant observers. Catholics, a tiny minority in colonial America, observe Christmas according to their own ancient traditions, though they often do so quietly, aware that their faith marks them as suspicious in Protestant-dominated communities. The midnight mass, the manger scenes, the saints' days leading up to and following Christmas, these practices survive in small pockets, preserved by families who have maintained their faith despite generations of Protestant majority. Quakers occupy a peculiar position. They recognise no holy days at all, considering the elevation of any particular date above others to be a form of idolatry. For Quakers, every day is equally sacred, and the notion that December 25th deserves special observance makes no more sense than elevating any random Tuesday. They meet for worship on what they call First Day, refusing to use the pagan-derived name Sunday, sitting in silence until the Spirit moves someone to speak. The religious landscape of colonial America is fractured, fragmented, and frequently contentious. Each denomination considers itself the true inheritor of Christian faith. Each looks upon the others with varying degrees of suspicion, pity, or outright hostility. The war has complicated these divisions, as religious affiliations often correlate with political loyalties. Anglican churches with their ties to the Church of England tend toward loyalism. Congregationalist and Presbyterian churches tend toward rebellion. But exceptions abound, and plenty of families find themselves attending churches whose majority political sentiment differs from their own. The service ends, and the congregation files out, exchanging brief greetings before hurrying towards home and warmth. The minister shakes hands at the door, his fingers cold despite the gloves he wears, his face fixed in the expression of reserved benevolence that his position requires. You murmur appropriate responses to his inquiries about your family's health, then escape into the December air, which feels almost warm compared to the unheated church interior. The walk home provides time for reflection. Religion in 1776 is not a private matter, a personal choice that can be kept separate from public life. It shapes marriage prospects, business relationships, social standing and political alliances. Your church attendance, or non-attendance, announces your place in the community as clearly as your clothing or your occupation. The decision to observe or not observe Christmas carries meaning beyond the religious, signalling which cultural tradition you claim, which community you belong to, which vision of American life you support. You arrive home, frozen and thoughtful, and begin the process of warming up that always follows outdoor excursion. The fire needs building, the children need feeding, the animals need tending regardless of what day it is, the domestic rhythms resume, religious observance complete for the week, the question of Christmas still unresolved in your mind. Perhaps you think the question does not need resolving. Perhaps the ambiguity itself is appropriate for a country in the midst of reinventing itself, a society where old certainties have shattered and new ones have not yet solidified. The December that approaches will be whatever you and your household make of it, shaped by your choices within the constraints of your circumstances. The fire crackles, the afternoon light fades, and somewhere in churches and meeting houses throughout the colonies, other families are facing the same questions, reaching their own conclusions, navigating the same uncertain terrain. The news arrives 3 days later, carried by a rider who looks like he has not slept in a week. The British have taken Philadelphia. Well, not quite. They have threatened Philadelphia, forced Congress to flee, established dominance over more of the mid-Atlantic than seemed possible even a month ago. The revolution, already reeling from summer's defeats, appears to be collapsing entirely. You stand in your doorway, watching the rider disappear down the road, feeling the news settle into your stomach like a stone. The war has been present as background anxiety for over a year now, but this is different. This feels like ending, like the moment when a fever breaks or kills, when an enterprise succeeds or fails. General Washington's army has retreated across New Jersey, leaving behind towns and farms to British occupation. The Hessian soldiers, those German mercenaries you have heard so much about, garrison positions throughout the region, including the town of Trenton, just across the Delaware River from where Washington's forces huddle in desperation. You think about what British victory would mean for your household, for your community, for the uncertain future you have been trying to build. The punishments for rebellion could be severe: property seizure, imprisonment, even execution for those deemed most culpable. Even if such extreme measures do not materialize, the social consequences would reshape everything. Loyalist neighbors who have been keeping quiet would become ascendant. Patriot supporters who have been vocal might find themselves marginalized, or worse. The networks of credit and trust that sustain colonial economy would realign around new power structures. Inside, you share the news with your spouse, watching her face shift through the same emotions you experienced: shock, fear, calculation, and finally a kind of resigned determination. There is nothing to be done about the war from here, nothing ordinary people can do to influence events unfolding miles away. You will continue your daily survival, tending fires and feeding livestock and preparing whatever December observance you can manage, while the fate of the revolution is decided by armies you will never see. The Continental Army's situation is genuinely desperate. Washington commands perhaps 6,000 men, down from 3 times that number earlier in the year. Disease has claimed as many soldiers as battle. Desertion has claimed more. Enlistments expire on January 1st, and many soldiers have made clear their intention to go home when that date arrives, regardless of the war's progress. Without a dramatic change in fortune, the army will simply dissolve, leaving the revolution without military force to sustain it. Historians still argue whether Washington genuinely understood how close the cause stood to collapse, or whether his famous calm concealed genuine ignorance of the situation's severity. His correspondence from this period suggests awareness. He writes of dark days and desperate times, but maintaining troop morale required, projecting confidence even when confidence seemed unwarranted. The general may have known exactly how bad things were while pretending otherwise. You go about your afternoon tasks in a fog of distraction. The chickens do not care about the war, they need feeding regardless. The fire does not care, it needs wood regardless. The persistent demands of survival continue, overlaid now with the knowledge that everything might change, that the world you have been building might be swept away by events beyond your control. The British occupation of New Jersey means that Christmas, whatever it might have meant otherwise, will be shaped by military reality. The Hessian garrison at Trenton presumably plans its own observances. Germans celebrate Christmas more enthusiastically than many English. And the soldiers likely anticipate some festivity despite being far from home. The British officers in New York are certainly planning elaborate celebrations, balls and feasts that will demonstrate their confidence in ultimate victory. For ordinary colonists caught between the armies, Christmas becomes something to survive rather than celebrate. The presence of occupying troops means requisitions, forced purchases, often at unfair prices, of food, firewood, and anything else the army needs. It means the potential for violence if someone is suspected of aiding the rebels. It means walking carefully, speaking carefully, revealing nothing that might attract unwanted attention. You are fortunate, relatively speaking. Your settlement lies far enough from current troop concentrations to escape the worst of occupation's burdens. But the ripples spread outward, affecting trade, disrupting travel, creating the atmosphere of tension and uncertainty that pervades December 1776. Every stranger might be a spy, every conversation might be reported, every decision carries consequences that cannot be fully predicted. Evening arrives, and you gather with your family for supper. The meal is the same. As always, the eternal stew, the coarse bread, the cider that maintains its steady presence regardless of political circumstances. But the conversation is different. You discuss what you have heard, what it might mean, what contingencies you should prepare for. The children listen with the wide eyes of young people suddenly aware that the adult world contains dangers they had not previously considered. This is what the revolution looks like from ground level. Not heroic battles and stirring speeches, but anxious families gathered around fires, trying to guess what the future holds, hoping that decisions made by distant generals will not destroy everything they have built. The grand narrative of American independence, the story that will be told in history books and commemorative paintings, emerges from the millions of individual experiences like this one. Small, worried, uncertain, sustained only by the stubborn determination to continue. You think about George Washington trying to imagine what he is doing at this moment. Is he pacing in some Pennsylvania farmhouse contemplating the ruin of his army? Is he meeting with officers planning desperate measures? Is he sleeping, if sleep is even possible under such circumstances? The general is a figure of rumour and reputation, someone you have never met and likely never will, yet his decisions will shape your life more profoundly than any choice you can make yourself. The fire burns low, the children are sent to bed, and you sit with your spouse in the gathering dark, two small figures in a vast and uncertain world, waiting to learn whether the experiment in self-government will survive or become a cautionary tale told by victors. December 1776 presses on, cold and dark and heavy with consequence. The days pass, each one carrying rumours that shift and contradict the day before. Washington is crossing the Delaware. Washington has been captured. Washington is negotiating surrender. Washington is planning something audacious. You learn to discount most of what you hear, understanding that news transforms through each retelling, gaining or losing details depending on the teller's prejudices and imagination. The truth, whatever it is, will emerge eventually. For now, you have only fragments. What you do not know, what no one outside the Continental Army's inner circle knows, is that Washington has been planning his gamble for weeks. The idea is almost absurdly simple. Cross the Delaware River on Christmas night, march 9 miles to Trenton, and attack the Hessian garrison before they fully wake from their holiday celebrations. The plan depends on surprise, on speed, on the enemy's assumption that no army would be foolish enough to attempt a river crossing in December's ice and cold. You go about your tasks as this plan takes shape miles away. The preparations in your own household continue, the gradual accumulation of preserved foods, the checking and rechecking of stores, the small to preparations that might allow some modest December observance. You have no way of knowing that these parallel preparations, yours domestic and Washington's military, will converge in a single moment that changes everything. The Continental Army gathering on the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware is a pitiful sight by military standards. The soldiers are exhausted, many sick, most inadequately clothed and supplied. Shoes are scarce, men wrap their feet in rags, leaving the bloody tracks in the snow. Food is irregular, depending on whatever the commissary can scrounge from surrounding farms. Morale has cratered after months of defeat, retreat, and the dawning realization that their cause might be lost. Yet Washington sees opportunity where others see only despair. The Hessian garrison at Trenton, commanded by Colonel Johann Rohl, has grown complacent. They expect no American attack. Who would be foolish enough to cross an icy river in midwinter? They have settled into quarters, looking forward to Christmas festivities that will include drinking, gambling, and the peculiarly German custom of maintaining celebration long after the actual day has passed. Historians still argue whether the Hessians were genuinely surprised, or whether warnings had reached them that they simply failed to act upon. Evidence exists for both interpretations. Colonel Rohl reportedly received notes warning of possible attack, but he allegedly dismissed them, stuffing them in his pocket unread. Whether this represents arrogance, incompetence, or simply the normal fog of war remains debated. You split firewood on an afternoon that Washington spends in final planning sessions. The axe falls, the wood splits, the pile grows. This is your contribution to survival, your small piece of the vast human enterprise that 1776 represents. You cannot command armies or make strategic decisions, but you can prepare fuel that will keep your family warm through whatever comes next. The crossing is set for December 25th, Christmas night. Washington has divided his force into 3 groups, each assigned to cross the river at different points and converge on Trenton from multiple directions. The plan is ambitious, perhaps too ambitious for an army in such poor condition, but desperation demands ambitious action. A cautious approach, waiting for better weather or better supplies, would simply delay the inevitable collapse when enlistments expire on January 1st. You know none of this. You experience December 25th Centaur as another cold day in an endless succession of cold days. There may be some acknowledgement of the holiday in your household, a slightly better meal, a moment of prayer, perhaps a small gift for the children, but the grand drama unfolding along the Delaware remains invisible to you, its significance apparent only in retrospect. The weather, which has been merely cold, turns vicious on Christmas Day. A nor'easter blows in, dropping temperatures and pelting the region with a mixture of rain, sleet, and snow. The Delaware River, already dangerous with floating ice, becomes even more treacherous. Washington's men, already suffering, face conditions that test the limits of human endurance. In your home, you add extra wood to the fire, grateful for shelter that keeps the worst of the storm outside. The wind howls, rattling shutters and finding every gap in the wall's construction. You pull blankets tighter, cluster closer to the hearth, endure the storm as your ancestors have endured countless storms before. Somewhere miles away, men are marching through this same storm, moving toward battle, betting everything on a desperate gamble. The divergence between your experience and theirs could not be more stark. You are warm, relatively speaking. They are freezing. You are safe, relatively speaking. They are marching toward violence. You will wake tomorrow to the same tasks you perform today. They may not wake at all. Yet the two experiences connect through invisible threads of cause and consequence. If Washington's gamble fails, the defeat will ripple outward, affecting trade, politics, social relations, ultimately reaching even your remote settlement. If Washington's gamble succeeds, the victory will ripple similarly, reshaping the world in ways you cannot yet imagine. Your December and theirs are separated by miles but joined by fate. You eat your Christmas supper, whatever modest fare you have managed to assemble, without knowing that history is being made. The children are perhaps slightly more cheerful than usual. Perhaps there is a small treat, an extra portion of something sweet, and a story are told with a more animation than normal. The observation is small, personal, disconnected from the momentous events occurring elsewhere. Night falls, the storm continues, and somewhere on the Delaware River, Durham boats are beginning to push off from shore, carrying ragged soldiers toward a destiny that will transform American history. You sleep, they do not. While you dream by your fire, Colonel Johann Rall and his Hessian soldiers are preparing their own Christmas observance. The garrison at Trenton numbers roughly 1,500 men, professional soldiers who have been fighting for pay since they were old enough to hold weapons. They come from Hesse Castle and other German principalities, hired out by their rulers to the British Crown, serving a cause that is not theirs in a land they barely understand. The Hessians have a reputation. The American colonists speak of them in tones mixing fear and hatred, describing them as brutal mercenaries who show no quarter. Some of this reputation is earned. The Hessians have fought hard and sometimes harshly during the campaign. Some of it is propaganda, exaggerated tales designed to inflame patriot sentiment against the British and their allies. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. What is certain is that the Hessians celebrate Christmas. They come from a culture where the holiday retains the significance that English Puritans tried to strip away. German Christmas traditions, the decorated trees, the special foods, the religious observances, the family gatherings, survive in the hearts of soldiers far from home, and Trenton's occupation provides the materials for celebration even in a hostile land. Colonel Rall has commandeered a house for his headquarters, a fine structure by local standards, where he can maintain the dignity his rank demands. On Christmas Eve, he hosts a gathering for his officers, with card games and drinking that continue into the early morning hours. The celebration is perhaps too enthusiastic. Rall will reportedly still be dealing with its after effects when the attack comes, but it is also completely understandable. These men are far from home, in a war they did not choose, facing a winter that seems endless. Of course they want to celebrate. The enlisted men mark Christmas in their own ways, gathered in the taverns and boarding houses where they are quartered. They drink the rum that forms such a large part of colonial life, sing the German carols they learned as children, share whatever special foods they have managed to acquire. Some have written letters home, knowing the letters may not arrive for months, trying to describe experiences that defy easy description. A German Christmas in a Pennsylvania town watching snowfall on unfamiliar landscape. The strangeness of it all must be overwhelming. Historians still argue whether the Hessians' Christmas celebration contributed to their defeat, whether the drinking and late nights left them unprepared for the attack that followed. The traditional narrative, drunken soldiers sleeping off their Christmas revels caught completely by surprise, has been challenged by historians who note that Hessian discipline remained tight even during holidays, that patrols continued on Christmas night, that the garrison was not as completely off guard as patriotic legend suggests. What seems clear is that the Hessians did not expect an attack. The weather alone seemed to rule it out. No sensible commander would send troops across an icy river in a blizzard. The American army, from everything the Hessians knew, was a ragged, demoralized force barely capable of holding itself together, much less launching offensive operations. Colonel Rall had reportedly been warned of possible American movements, but he discounted the warnings, confident in his assessment of the enemy's weakness. The irony is that Rall was mostly right. Washington's army was ragged and demoralized. It was barely capable of holding itself together. The only thing Rull got wrong was the conclusion he drew from these facts, that such an army would not attack. He failed to understand that desperation can drive actions that prudence would reject, that an army with nothing to lose might risk everything precisely because the alternative is certain. Dissolution. You know nothing of Colonel Rull or his calculations. The Hessians are distant figures in your imagination, fearsome but abstract, their actual humanity obscured by propaganda and distance. You do not picture them singing carols, missing their families, drinking to drown the melancholy of service far from home. You picture them as the enemy, a category that erases individual experience and replaces it with threat. This is how war works, perhaps necessarily. The soldier who sees the enemy as a fellow human being, with Christmas traditions and family memories and fear and hope, has a harder time pulling the trigger. The abstraction of enmity serves military purposes even as it distorts truth. The Hessians in Trenton go to sleep on Christmas night, some of them very late indeed, confident that morning will bring nothing more challenging than dealing with hangovers and continuing the tedious work of occupation. They have survived the fall campaign, established themselves in comfortable quarters, and have every reason to expect a quiet winter. Spring will bring renewed fighting, but spring is far away. They do not know that Durham boats are already crossing the Delaware, that columns of frozen American soldiers are assembling on the New Jersey shore, that their comfortable assumptions are about to shatter. They sleep the sleep of men who believe themselves safe, not knowing that the morning will bring the most consequential battle of the war so far. The storm continues through the night, driving snow and sleet, dropping temperatures, making everything harder for everyone. Washington's crossing falls behind schedule. Ice on the river is worse than expected. Boats are fewer than planned. Everything takes longer in the dark and cold. The attack, originally scheduled for 5 in the morning, will not begin until 8. 3 hours of daylight that might have been used in approaching will instead illuminate the final march. But the delay does not doom the operation. The Hessians, confident in their safety, do not discover the American approach. The columns form, the march begins, and history moves toward its pivot point. Morning is coming. Christmas Day is becoming the day after Christmas, and nothing will be the same. Christmas Eve in your household passes quietly, as most evenings pass quietly in December 1776. You sit by the fire, perhaps sharing stories or simply sharing silence with your family. The wind outside has picked up, driving the sleet and snow that will make this storm memorable for decades. Inside, the fire provides what warmth it can, and you pull your chair closer, feeling the heat on your face while your back remains cold. If your family marks Christmas at all, the observance is modest. Perhaps there is a moment of prayer, acknowledging the religious meaning of the day. Perhaps there is a slightly better meal than usual, drawing on preserved luxuries that have been saved for this occasion. Perhaps there are small gifts, practical items wrapped in cloth, given without the elaborate ceremony that later generations will develop. The celebration, if celebration is the right word, is quiet, personal, almost secret in its intimacy. You think about what others are doing this night. The German settlers in their Pennsylvania communities are gathered around candlelit trees, singing carols in a language most colonists do not understand. The Virginia planters are hosting elaborate parties, their great houses blazing with light, their tables groaning with food that represents weeks of preparation. The New England ministers are preparing sermons for tomorrow's ordinary services, pointedly refusing to acknowledge any special significance to the date. And somewhere, just a few miles away as the crow flies, armies are preparing for something that will transform everything. The Continental Army assembles at McConkey's Ferry, stamping their feet against the cold, blowing on frozen hands, waiting for the boats that will carry them across the Delaware. Many of these soldiers have not eaten properly in days. Their clothing is inadequate. The famous image of bloody footprints in the snow is not artistic exaggeration but documentary fact. They are cold, they are hungry, they are demoralized, and they are about to attempt an operation that military science would call impossible. Washington moves among them, projecting the confidence that leadership requires even when confidence is unwarranted. He cannot show doubt, cannot reveal uncertainty, cannot allow his personal fears to undermine the morale of men who are already at breaking point. Whatever Washington actually feels, and his private letters suggest profound anxiety, He shows the army only calm determination. The boats are Durham boats, locally built vessels designed for hauling cargo up and down the Delaware. They are long, flat-bottomed, capable of carrying heavy loads but difficult to maneuver in good conditions and nearly impossible in bad ones. Ice flows threaten to crush their hulls. The current threatens to sweep them downstream. The soldiers, many of whom have never handled a boat in their lives, struggle with unfamiliar equipment while the storm rages around them. Historians still argue whether the crossing was genuinely as difficult as traditional accounts suggest, or whether later narratives exaggerated for dramatic effect. Contemporary sources support the traditional view. Participants describe the crossing as a nightmare of ice and cold and barely controlled chaos. But contemporary sources are not immune to exaggeration either, and the temptation to enhance the drama of a successful operation is strong. What seems certain is that many soldiers who started the crossing did not complete it. Exposure, accident, and simple inability to continue reduced Washington's force before the battle even began. The plan called for 3 separate crossings. Only one actually succeeded in getting its entire force across. The attack on Trenton would be made with fewer men than planned, approaching from fewer directions than planned, beginning later than planned. And yet, the attack would succeed because the fundamental insight remained valid. The Hessians did not expect to be attacked, and surprise can compensate for many deficiencies. You know nothing of this as Christmas Eve becomes Christmas Day. You sleep or try to sleep huddled under blankets in a room that never gets fully warm. The wind howls outside and you pull the covers tighter, dimly aware that this is one of the worst storms in recent memory, grateful to be inside rather than out. On the other side of the Delaware, soldiers are finishing their crossing. On the Trenton side, columns are forming for the final march. The 9 miles between the crossing point and the town will take several hours to cover, through snow that has accumulated in drifts, in darkness that will gradually give way to dawn. The march itself becomes a test of endurance. Men who have been cold for weeks become colder. Men who have been hungry become hungrier. Men who have doubted their cause have plenty of time during the long dark miles to contemplate the wisdom of following a general who leads them into a storm toward an enemy of uncertain strength. But they continue marching. Whatever doubts they have, they keep their feet moving. The password for the night is victory or death. The phrase captures the stark simplicity of the army's situation. Win this battle or face dissolution and defeat. There is no middle ground, no comfortable option between triumph and catastrophe. The soldiers who march through the storm are betting everything, their lives, their freedom, their futures, on a single roll of the dice. You do not know the password. You do not know the march is happening. You sleep through history, dreaming whatever dreams December brings, unaware that miles away, men are rewriting the future with every frozen step. Morning is coming, the battle is coming, and the world is about to change. The crossing itself deserves examination, not as distant history, but as immediate visceral experience, the kind of experience you might have had if circumstance had placed you in a continental uniform rather than a Pennsylvania farmhouse. Imagine yourself in one of those Durham boats, one of perhaps 24 men, crammed into a vessel designed for cargo, pushing off from shore into a river filled with ice. The darkness is nearly complete. The storm has obscured moon and stars, leaving only the faint reflected glow of ice and snow to guide navigation. The boat rocks beneath you, responding to currents you cannot see, and ice flows you can barely avoid. Around you, men grip the gunwales with white-knuckled intensity, terrified not of the enemy waiting on the other shore but of the river itself, the immediate danger that promises death by drowning or freezing, long before any Hessian bullet can find its mark. The polar men, Marblehead fishermen from Massachusetts, men who have spent their lives on the water, work the long poles that push the boats forward. They are experienced sailors, comfortable with maritime chaos in ways that the landlubber soldiers can only envy. Without them, the crossing would be genuinely impossible. With them, it is merely extraordinarily difficult. Ice scrapes against the hull, a sound like nails on slate, each collision raising the terrifying possibility of breach. The boats are sturdy but not indestructible, and the ice chunks carried by the current possess crushing force. A direct hit could shatter planks, could spill men into water so cold that survival time is measured in minutes rather than hours. The polemen navigate by instinct and luck, threading paths through the frozen obstacles, sometimes pushing ice away with their poles when avoidance proves impossible. You're cold in ways that transcend mere temperature. The cold has become a presence, a malevolent entity that seeks your destruction with patient determination. Your hands have lost feeling. You are not sure whether you could grip a weapon if you needed to. Your feet have passed through pain into numbness, which might be blessing or might be the beginning of frostbite. Your face burns where wind-driven ice particles strike exposed skin. Historians still argue whether the soldiers who made the crossing understood its significance or simply endured one more misery in a war that had supplied many. The immediate experience, the fear, the cold, the disorientation of darkness and storm would have dominated consciousness, leaving little room for historical reflection. Significance is always clearer in retrospect. The boat grounds on the New Jersey shore, its bottom scraping against gravel that extends beneath the ice. You climb out, legs unsteady from the journey, and join the mass of soldiers assembling in the darkness. Officers shout orders that the wind tears away, gestures, compensating for words that cannot be heard. Somehow, despite the chaos, formations take shape. Columns form, the march begins. The 9 miles to Trenton would be manageable in good weather, on good roads. In the aftermath of a blizzard, over ground alternating between frozen mud and fresh snow, the distance becomes an ordeal. Men stumble and fall, sometimes lying in the snow for long moments before summoning the strength to rise. Officers circulate through the column, encouraging, threatening, sometimes physically lifting soldiers who have stopped moving. The password circulates, "Victory or death." The phrase captures the mood better than any speech could. This is the end, one way or another. Win here and the revolution survives. Lose here and everything collapses. No one believes there will be another chance. You march because everyone around you marches, because stopping means dying, because forward is the only direction that offers any hope. The cold has hollowed you out, reducing consciousness to the simple repetition of putting one foot in front of the other. The enemy ahead seems almost abstract compared to the immediate reality of weather and fatigue. Dawn comes slowly, grey light seeping into a grey world. The snow has stopped, leaving the landscape draped in white that would be beautiful under other circumstances. The columns approach Trenton from 2 directions, Washington with one group and General Sullivan with another, the pincer movement that will trap the Hessians between converging attacks. The first shots come from sentries, Hessians posted at the edge of town who spot the approaching Americans and raise the alarm. But the alarm comes too late. The columns are already entering the town, already engaging targets, already transforming the sleeping garrison into chaos. You fire your weapon, if your weapon has remained dry enough to fire, if your fingers have recovered enough feeling to work the mechanism, and reload and fire again. The drill, you have practiced creating automatic responses that require no thought. Around you, men are shouting, shooting, dying. The Hessians pour from their quarters, many still half-dressed, grabbing weapons and trying to form defensive positions against an attack that seems to come from everywhere at once. The Battle of Trenton lasts perhaps 45 minutes. It is not a lengthy engagement by military standards, but it is complete, decisive, transformative. The Hessians, overwhelmed and outmaneuvered, surrender. Colonel Roll, mortally wounded, gives up his sword. Approximately 1,000 prisoners are taken. The American casualties number only a handful of wounded, and the 2 men who froze to death during the march. History has been made, but in the moment, there is only exhaustion, relief, and the slow realization that against all odds, you are still alive. The battle sounds reach you not at all. The distance is too great. The storm has muffled everything, and the brief engagement in Trenton occurs while you are still sleeping or just waking to another December morning. You rise, tend the fire, begin the daily routine without any awareness that the world has changed overnight. The first indication that something has happened comes later in the day, when a traveller on the road, moving faster than the weather should permit, shouts something about a victory as he passes. The word Trenton reaches your ears, but the context is unclear. Victory at Trenton? What does that mean? You step outside, hoping for more information, but the traveller is already gone, his urgency carrying him toward a destinations unknown. The news will emerge in fragments over the coming days, each fragment adding detail to a picture that gradually resolves into clarity. Washington crossed the Delaware on Christmas night. The army attacked Trenton at dawn. The Hessian garrison was captured, nearly every man taken prisoner or killed. The general is preparing to withdraw back across the river. But the withdrawal is orderly, triumphant, nothing like the desperate retreats that characterized the fall campaign. The emotional impact of this news is difficult to convey across the centuries. For weeks, the revolutionary cause has seemed doomed. The army was dissolving, the British were ascendant, loyalists were emboldened while patriots grew quiet. And then, suddenly, impossibly, everything changes. A victory, a real victory, proof that the Continental Army can fight and win against professional soldiers. You stand in your doorway, processing the news that a neighbour has brought in more detail. 1,000 Hessian prisoners, 1,000 professional soldiers captured by the ragged army that everyone had written off. The numbers seem almost too good to be true, and indeed they will be revised slightly as accurate counts replace initial estimates. But the essential fact remains: Washington gambled everything and won. Historians still argue about the Battle of Trenton's military significance versus its psychological impact. Militarily, the engagement was small, a garrison captured, some supplies seized, and no strategic territory permanently gained. Washington withdrew across the Delaware after the battle, returning to essentially the same position he had occupied before the attack. In pure military terms, Trenton changed little, but psychologically, Trenton changed everything. The victory proved that the Continental Army could win. It proved that Washington's leadership remained viable. It gave patriots something to celebrate after months of defeat. It undermined loyalist confidence that British victory was inevitable. It convinced soldiers whose enlistments were about to expire to remain with the army a little longer. The revolution, which had been dying, began to revive. You find yourself smiling, actually smiling, an expression that has become rare in the anxious weeks of late December. The victory does not solve your immediate problems. The cold remains. The food supply remains precarious. The war remains a source of danger and uncertainty. But somehow the knowledge that Washington has won changes how you experience everything else. The prisoners, you learn over the following days, are being marched to Philadelphia and other locations for confinement. 1,000 men, Germans, who travelled across an ocean to fight in a war that was not theirs, now walk as captives through the country they had helped occupy. Some colonists gather to watch them pass, hurling insults at the defeated enemy. Others express surprising sympathy, recognising the prisoners as men, caught up in circumstances beyond their control. The Hessians' treatment will become its own historical footnote. Washington issues orders for humane treatment, understanding that propaganda value lies in demonstrating that the American cause operates according to civilized principles. Some prisoners will eventually be paroled, some will switch sides and settle in America, some will spend years in captivity waiting for exchange. Their individual fates will vary, but collectively they represent the first major American victory of the war. You think about what comes next. The victory at Trenton does not end the war. Far from it. Years of fighting remain, years of uncertainty and suffering and death. But the victory suggests that winning is possible, that the enormous sacrifice demanded by the revolution might not be made in vain. This matters. This changes how you face the coming year. The December that began in anxiety and fear is ending, with something almost like hope. The war continues, the cold continues, the daily demands of survival continue. But the context has shifted. The revolution has a future again. You add wood to the fire and begin preparing the evening meal, moving through familiar tasks with unfamiliar lightness. The news has been good. For the first time in weeks, the news has been genuinely, unambiguously good. The immediate aftermath of Trenton creates ripples that spread outward through the colonies, reaching your settlement within days and continuing to develop over the weeks that follow. You piece together the story from the travelers' reports, from newspapers that arrive with predictable delays, from conversations with neighbours who have heard their own fragmentary accounts. The picture that emerges is one of audacity rewarded and desperation transformed into triumph. The Hessian prisoners number somewhere around 900, the count varying slightly depending on who is doing the counting and when. Colonel Roll died of his wounds the day after the battle, expiring in the very house where he had hosted his Christmas Eve celebration. The irony is too perfect. The officer who dismissed warnings of American attack, who perhaps overindulged in holiday revelry, paying the ultimate price for his overconfidence. Whether the portrait is fair to roll remains debated by historians, but it has stuck. The prisoners themselves present both opportunity and problem. They represent a propaganda victory, living proof of American martial capability, but they also require feeding, housing, and guarding at a time when the Continental Army can barely manage its own logistics. Washington sends them to various locations throughout Pennsylvania and beyond, distributing the burden while maximizing the symbolic impact of marching them through communities that have doubted the revolution's viability. You never see the prisoners directly. They pass through routes that do not include your settlement, and you are not inclined to travel in December's cold just to gawk at captured soldiers. But you hear the reports, the prisoners' visible exhaustion, their inadequate clothing against the American winter, the mixture of fear and resignation on faces that have seen everything change in a single morning. The treatment of the Hessians becomes a subject of discussion throughout the colonies. Some argue for harsh conditions, repayment for the suffering the Hessians inflicted during their campaign. Others argue for mercy, demonstrating that the American cause represents civilization rather than barbarism. Washington's orders favour the latter approach, though implementation varies depending on local circumstances and individual prejudices. Some prisoners eventually convert to the American cause, settling in the country they came to conquer. The German-American communities that already exist in Pennsylvania welcome some of these men, offering language and culture that the prisoners recognise. Historians will later trace descendants of Hessian soldiers through American genealogy, finding the strange routes by which former enemies became citizens. The morale shift in the Continental Army is dramatic and immediate. Soldiers who were counting days until their enlistments expired begin reconsidering. Washington speaks to them, mercilessly and through officers, asking them to stay a little longer, to build on the victory rather than walking away just as things improve. Some agree, some do not. But the overall spirit has shifted from despair to cautious optimism. You feel this shift yourself, though you are not a soldier and have no enlistment to renew. The news from Trenton has changed something in how you perceive the world. The British seemed unstoppable before Christmas. Now they seem merely formidable. The revolution seemed doomed. Now it seems possible. These are subtle shifts in perception, difficult to quantify, but they matter enormously for how people behave. The British response to Trenton is, predictably, to downplay its significance. Official reports emphasise the small scale of the engagement, the recovery that will surely follow, the fundamental reality of British military superiority that one surprise attack cannot change. These reports are not entirely wrong. Trenton was a small battle, and the British remain far stronger than the Americans in every conventional measure. But the reports miss what Trenton means psychologically, culturally, symbolically. You go about your post-Christmas days with renewed energy. The tasks remain the same. The fire still needs tending. The animals still need feeding. The endless work of winter survival still demands attention. But you approach these tasks differently now, with something that might be called hope. The future remains uncertain, but uncertainty has become something you can live with, rather than a source of paralysing dread. The newspapers that arrive carry stories about Trenton, alongside other news that once again recedes into background noise. The war will continue for years, but this moment, the strange convergence of Christmas, ice, desperation and audacity, will be remembered long after the other news is forgotten. You think about the soldiers who made that crossing, who marched through the storm, who attacked at dawn despite every reason to believe the attack would fail. What must it have been like to be one of them? What must it have taken to continue putting one foot in front of another when the cold numbed every extremity and the odds seemed hopeless? You do not know. You cannot know. You experience December 1776 from a different position, one of civilian anxiety rather than military action. But you can appreciate what they accomplished, what their victory means for you and everyone like you. The fire crackles, the winter continues, and somewhere the revolution marches on. News travels slowly in 1776, a fact that modern minds struggle to fully grasp. The Battle of Trenton occurred on December the 26th. You learned about it in fragments over the following days, but in distant corners of the colonies, in South Carolina, in Georgia, in the settlements pushing into the frontier, people will not hear of the victory for weeks, possibly months. They are living in a world where the revolution appears to be failing, unaware that events have already changed everything. This temporal disconnect shapes how you think about information. There is no real-time news, no instant updates, no way to know what is happening beyond the range of your own observation except through the slow accumulation of reports carried by travellers, letters, and occasional newspapers. You learn to live with uncertainty, to make decisions based on incomplete information, to accept that the world beyond your immediate surroundings operates according to its own rhythms. The mechanisms of news transmission in colonial America are various and unreliable. Official post roads exist, maintained with varying degrees of care, carrying letters and newspapers between major cities. Private riders supplement the post, delivering messages for a fee. Taverns serve as information exchanges, where travellers share what they have seen and heard. Ministers sometimes read important news from pulpits, incorporating current events into their religious message. None of these mechanisms approach speed or reliability. A letter from Philadelphia to New York might take 3 to 5 days under good conditions, much longer in winter. A letter from Philadelphia to Charleston might take 2 weeks or more. News from Europe, arriving by a ship, is months old by the time it reaches American shores. You learn to discount freshness as a quality of information, to understand that news is always history by the time you hear it. The Trenton victory spreads through this slow system, transforming morale as it travels. In Philadelphia, the news arrives almost immediately, boosting confidence in the city that had been terrified of British approach. In Boston, it takes perhaps a week, confirming what New England patriots had hoped, that their southern allies retained fighting capacity. In the frontier settlements, it takes longer, gradually shifting the psychological balance that has favoured loyalism in many contested areas. You imagine the moment when some distant settler, perhaps in the Carolina, back country or the Kentucky Territory, finally hears that Washington won at Trenton. For that person, the news is weeks old, describing events that have long since generated their own consequences. But for that person, the news is also fresh, transformative, carrying the same emotional impact it carried for you when you first heard it. Historians still argue whether the slow speed of communication in colonial America was primarily a limitation, or whether it served certain social functions. Some suggest that the delay allowed for cooling of hot tempers, for reflection before reaction, for a kind of deliberation that instant communication forecloses. Others note that the same delay allowed rumours to spread unchecked, false information to influence decisions, and coordination to fail at critical moments. You read a newspaper that has arrived a week late. Its accounts of events already superseded by more recent developments you have heard from travellers. The newspaper describes Trenton as a developing situation, uncertain of final outcomes that you already know. The experience is disorienting, reading anxious speculation about events whose resolution you learned yesterday, and it highlights the strange temporal layers that colonial life involves. The newspaper also contains advertisements, letters, and local notices that now seem trivial against the backdrop of war. Someone is selling a horse, someone is seeking a runaway servant, someone is advertising land for sale. Life continues alongside war, the ordinary transactions of society persisting even as armies march and battles rage. You read these mundane items with something like affection, evidence that normal existence has not entirely ceased. Your own communication with the wider world is limited. You can write letters if you have paper, ink, and someone to carry them to the post. You can send messages by travellers if you trust them and if they are travelling in the right direction. But mostly you receive rather than transmit, absorbing information that flows toward you rather than projecting your own observations outward. This passivity shapes how you experience historical events. You are witness rather than participant, audience rather than actor. The great decisions are made elsewhere, by people you have never met, and you learn of them only after the fact. Your role is to endure the consequences, to adapt to changes you did not choose, to survive whatever circumstances history creates. The fire needs more wood. You add it, watching the flames climb around the fresh fuel. The winter continues, the war continues, and news continues to trickle in through the various channels that connect your settlement to the wider world. Somewhere someone is composing an account of Trenton that will become the official version, the narrative that future generations will inherit. But you have your own version, assembled from fragments, shaped by your particular position and perspective, no less valid for being unofficial. The reaction to Trenton varies wildly depending on who is doing the reacting. You observe these variations within your own settlement, a microcosm of the larger colonial divisions that the revolution has exposed and deepened. Patriots celebrate, loyalists fume, and the large middle ground of people who simply want the conflict to end watch both factions with wary neutrality. Your nearest neighbour to the north, a man whose loyalist sympathies are well known if carefully unexpressed, responds to the Trenton news with visible dismay. You see it in his face when the subject arises. See how he changes topics quickly, how he retreats into complaints about the weather, rather than engaging with political discussion. For him, the Hessian defeat represents not victory but setback, evidence that the rebellion retains dangerous vitality. Your nearest neighbour to the south, a committed patriot who has 2 sons serving in the Continental Army, responds with uncomplicated joy. He speaks of the battle with an enthusiasm that borders on gloating, as if the victory were personally his rather than Washington's. His celebrations irritate the loyalist neighbour, and you can feel the tension between them ratcheting higher with each passing day. You position yourself carefully between these extremes. Your own sympathies lean patriot. You would not be surviving winter in the colonies if you did not have some commitment to the American cause, but you understand the value of maintaining civil relations with all nice neighbours. The war will end someday, and whoever wins, you will need to continue living in this community. Burning bridges with either faction seems unwise. The civilian reaction to Trenton matters because civilians will ultimately determine the war's outcome. Armies can win battles, but controlling territory requires the cooperation, or at least acquiescence, of the population. The British strategy has assumed that loyalist sentiment runs deep in the colonies, that most Americans prefer raw rule, and will return to allegiance once the rebellion is suppressed. Trenton challenges this assumption, suggesting that patriot sentiment may be more robust than British strategists believed. Historians still argue whether Trenton fundamentally changed civilian attitudes or simply revealed attitudes that already existed. The evidence is mixed. Some regions that had seemed loyalist before Trenton shifted patriot afterward. Other regions showed no change at all. The relationship between military events and political loyalty is complex, mediated by local conditions, family connections, economic interests, and countless other factors that resist easy generalization. You notice small changes in your own settlement after Trenton. People who had been quiet about their political views become slightly more vocal, patriots more openly patriotic, loyalists more carefully silent. The balance of who dominates conversations shifts subtly. The assumption that British victory is inevitable, which had been growing throughout the fall, begins to erode. These shifts matter, even if they seem trivial against the grand drama of armies and battles. Civilian cooperation means intelligence about enemy movements, supplies for friendly troops, shelter for soldiers on the march. Civilian resistance means sabotage, information leaks, ambushes from populations that armies thought they had pacified. The war is fought not just between uniformed forces, but in the daily decisions of ordinary people about whose side they are on. Your own decisions continue to be made carefully. You share news with neighbours who seem trustworthy, withhold news from neighbours who seem suspicious. You contribute to the patriot cause when asked, but avoid drawing attention that might make you a target if circumstances change. Survival requires balance, an awareness that today's loyalty may need to be reframed depending on tomorrow's events. The children observe these adults, maneuverings without fully understanding them. They know that some families are different, that some names are spoken with warmth and others with caution, but the reasons remain obscure. Childhood in revolutionary America involves absorbing political loyalties before being able to articulate them, learning which side your family supports through thousands of subtle cues. You think about what memory of this December your children will carry into their future. Will they remember the tension, the careful conversations, the way adults fell silent when certain topics arose? Will they remember the moment when news of Trenton arrived, the sudden shift in atmospheric pressure that accompanied victory? Or will their memories blur everything together, the specifics lost in a general impression of difficult times survived? Memory is unreliable, shaped by later events, simplified into narratives that may or may not reflect actual experience. The December 1776 that your children will remember may bear little resemblance to the December 1776 you are actually living. But whatever they remember, they will remember that their family survived, that the revolution continued, that the world changed around them while they were too young to fully comprehend the changes. The fire burns, the evening deepens, and the various reactions to Trenton continue to ripple through your settlement and beyond. The victory has created its own consequences, some predictable and some not, all of them contributing to the strange future that waits to unfold. The final days of December 1776 pass in a strange liminal state, suspended between the Christmas that has passed and the New Year that approaches. The Trenton victory has changed the mood, but it has not changed the weather or the war or the fundamental challenges of winter survival. You continue your daily tasks, continue your careful navigation of neighborhood politics, continue waiting to see what comes next. Washington, you learn through the slow channels of colonial news, has not rested on his victory. Even as you hear accounts of Trenton, the general is planning a second crossing, another attack, a continuation of the aggressive strategy that caught the enemy by surprise. The British have reinforced their New Jersey positions, determined to avenge their Christmas humiliation. The armies are maneuvering toward another confrontation. This confrontation will occur at Princeton on January the 3rd, another American victory that cements Washington's reputation as a commander capable of aggressive, successful action. But you do not know this yet. You know only that the war continues, that more battles are coming, that the uncertainty which has characterized December will extend into January and beyond. The week between Christmas and New Year's has its own peculiar character in colonial America. The 12 days of Christmas, the traditional English celebration period running from December 25th to January 6th, still structure some families' observances, even families that have largely abandoned Christmas itself. The New Year carries its own associations, fresh starts, financial accounting, the renewal of contracts and agreements that traditionally expire with the old year. For the Continental Army, the New Year means the expiration of enlistments. Thousands of soldiers will become civilians on January 1st, free to go home regardless of the war's status. Washington spends much of the week between Christmas and New Year's trying to convince men to stay, to re-enlist for at least a few more weeks, to build on the Trenton victory rather than abandoning the cause at its moment of revival. Some soldiers agree, some do not. The army that enters January is smaller than the army that achieved victory at Trenton, its ranks thinned by men whose commitment has been exhausted. But it is also more committed, its remaining soldiers having chosen to continue despite every reason to go home. Quality substitutes, for quantity in ways that will prove important in the battles to come. You think about the soldiers making these decisions, trying to imagine the calculus they perform. Home offers warmth, family, the comforts of civilian life. The army offers cold, danger, the slim chance of glory and the substantial chance of death. What tips the balance? Belief in the cause? Personal loyalty to Washington? Economic calculation about the relative prospects of military versus civilian life? Some combination that varies from soldier to soldier? Historians still argue whether the soldiers who re-enlisted after Trenton did so primarily for ideological or practical reasons. Financial incentives were offered, bounties for re-enlistment, promises of pay that might or might not materialize. But money alone seems insufficient to explain why men chose to remain in conditions that would kill many of them. Something else, call it patriotism or duty or stubbornness, must have contributed. Your own New Year will arrive without fanfare. There is no Times Square ball drop, no champagne toast, no midnight countdown. The transition from 1776 to 1777 will pass like any other midnight, unmarked except by those who choose to mark it. Some families gather for modest celebrations. Others treat the day as ordinary. You will likely fall somewhere in between, acknowledging the occasion without elaborate observance. The year that ends has been extraordinary by any measure. It began with colonies in open rebellion against their sovereign. It produced a Declaration of Independence that announced, in language still startling in its audacity, that these colonies considered themselves free and independent states. It brought military disaster and apparent defeat. It ended with Trenton, with hope restored, with the revolution surviving against odds that seemed impossible. What will 1707 bring? You cannot know. No one can know. The future is genuinely uncertain. Its possibilities ranging from American law, victory to British triumph to some negotiated compromise that satisfies no one completely. You will face whatever comes with the same tools you have used thus far. Endurance, adaptability, the stubborn determination to survive that defines colonial existence. The fire needs tending. You rise to add wood. performing the action that has structured your winter days, the simple maintenance that makes everything else possible. The flames catch, the light dances, and another December evening moves toward its end. 1776 is almost over. The strangest Christmas in American history is becoming memory, and the future, whatever it holds, is about to begin. The final days of the year pass, and you find yourself reflecting on the December that is ending, trying to understand what it has meant and what it might mean for the future. This is not the Christmas you imagined, if you imagined Christmas at all. It is something stranger, harder, more significant than any celebration you could have planned. You have survived. This is the fundamental fact, the baseline from which all other assessments must proceed. You have survived the cold, the uncertainty, the threat of violence, the grinding demands of winter existence. Your household enters 1777 intact, its members still breathing, still working, still hoping for something better than the year just past provided. The war continues, but the war has changed. The Trenton victory, that improbable, desperate, magnificent gamble, has demonstrated that the American cause is not finished. Washington's army still exists, diminished but not destroyed, ready to fight another day. The revolution that seemed doomed in early December has been resurrected by late December, its prospects transformed by a single battle fought in the hours after Christmas. You think about the Christmas you did not have, the celebration that might have been. If circumstances had been different, if the war had not intervened, if the Puritan legacy had not suppressed holiday traditions, if resources had been more abundant, you might have experienced something like the festive December that later generations will consider normal. Decorated trees, elaborate feasts, gifts exchanged with loved ones, the whole apparatus of Christmas joy that will eventually define the holiday in American culture. Instead, you experience December 1776, a different kind of Christmas, a Christmas of survival rather than celebration, of anxiety rather than joy, of watching history unfold while trying simply to stay warm and fed. This Christmas will not appear in sentimental holiday cards, it does not lend itself to cozy nostalgia, but it is real, more real than the sanitized versions that will eventually replace it in cultural memory. Historians will later argue about what December 1776 meant for the development of American Christmas traditions. Some will suggest that the wartime conditions actually strengthened Christmas observance as people sought comfort and meaning in dark times. Others will note that the Puritan suppression remained powerful in many regions, and that Christmas would not become a major American holiday until decades after the Revolution ended. What seems clear is that December 1776 represents a hinge point, a moment when multiple forces, religious, cultural, military, political, converge to create an experience unlike anything before or since. The Americans who lived through this month were changed by it, shaped by circumstances that demanded extraordinary responses. They emerged into 1777 different from who they had been, their sense of themselves and their cause transformed by what they had endured. You think about the future stretching ahead, the years that will follow this December, the life you will build in whatever America emerges from the current conflict. There will be more hardships, certainly. The war has years to run, and even peace will bring its own challenges. But there will also be possibilities, opportunities, that the revolution might open, a future that is uncertain precisely because it has not been predetermined by British rule. The fire burns lower now, the logs having been consumed through the evening's conversation and reflection. You should add more wood, should maintain the warmth that has kept you alive through December's worst, but for a moment you simply sit, watching the embers glow, allowing the quiet to settle around you. The year ends tonight, the new year begins tomorrow, and between them lies a moment of stillness, a pause in the relentless forward motion of time when reflection becomes possible. You have learned things this December. You have learned that survival is possible even when survival seems impossible. You have learned that hope can persist through circumstances designed to extinguish it. You have learned that history is not something that happens to other people in other times, but something you are living through, your own small story woven into the larger tapestry of events. The fire has become embers now, glowing red-orange in the darkness, radiating the last of their heat into a room that will soon grow cold again. You will need to add wood soon to begin the cycle again, to maintain the warmth that makes everything else possible. But not quite yet. For this moment, you simply rest. The December of survival is ending. The year of uncertainty is closing. And somewhere in the vast and complicated world beyond your walls, a nation is being born from the wreckage of empire, from the hopes and fears of people like you, from the strange convergence of Christmas and war and cold and courage that has defined this extraordinary month. The embers glow, the darkness gathers, and gently, slowly, like snow falling on a sleeping landscape, you let your eyes close. Let consciousness drift toward the dreams that wait. Let the final night of 1776 carry you toward whatever morning brings. The year turns, the world changes, and you, having survived this December, having witnessed this Christmas, having endured this impossible month, drift finally, peacefully into the quiet darkness that precedes every new beginning. The fire whispers, the wind settles, the night deepens around you like a blanket, soft and dark and strangely warm. And December 76, that strangest of Christmases, that darkest of months, that turning point in the story of a nation, finally, gently, quietly comes to its end. Sleep now, the morning will come, and with it everything new. Rest, dream, let the history you have lived settle into memory. The year is ending, the future is beginning, and you have been here, through all of it, witness and survivor both. Sweet dreams.